There's a story most of us absorbed without ever being told it directly. It goes something like this. The old world had its ancient civilizations, Egypt with its pyramids, Mesopotamia with its ziggurats, Rome with its roads and aqueducts, while the New World, the Americas, sat largely empty and undeveloped until Europeans arrived to build something on it. Old stone cities on one side of the ocean, open wilderness on the other. It's a tidy story. It's also wrong, and not in some minor technical way. It's wrong at the foundation. By the time Columbus crossed the Atlantic, the Americas had already been home to cities older than the pyramids, empires larger than most of Europe, and engineering projects that modern hydrologists still study for clues about water management in dry climates. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was likely larger than any city in Spain at the time the Spanish first saw it. Cahokia, near what's now Street Louis, may have rivaled London in population around the year 1100. A site in coastal Peru was raising monumental architecture before the Great Pyramid of Giza was finished. So if the evidence is this substantial, why does the myth persist? That's really the question this whole script is built around. The answer isn't a single cause. It's a tangle of disease, decay, deliberate destruction, and a kind of historical convenience that made an empty continent easier to settle, easier to claim, and easier to write about than a continent that was already full. Over the chapters ahead, we're going to walk through that tangle piece by piece. We'll look at how cities are identified from nothing but dirt and old garbage pits. We'll visit the oldest urban center in the Americas, walk the earthen mounds of a city that vanished from popular memory, and stand, at least in imagination, in a marketplace that once drew tens of thousands of people on a single afternoon. We'll talk about why wood and earth disappear while stone endures, why a pandemic erased entire societies before most outsiders ever laid eyes on them, and why modern technology is now pulling cities out of the jungle that nobody knew were there. This isn't a story about absence. It's a story about erasure, and about everything erasure left behind for us to find. Before we go any further, we need to settle something that sounds simple, but turns out to be surprisingly slippery. What actually makes a place a city? It feels like a question with an obvious answer. You know a city when you see one: tall buildings, crowded streets, maybe a subway system, definitely a lot of people packed into a small space. But archaeologists who study the deep past don't have subways or skyscrapers to look for. They have dirt. They have post holes and pottery shards and the faint chemical signature of old garbage pits. So they had to come up with a different set of rules, and those rules end up shaping which ancient places get called cities in textbooks and which ones get quietly left out. This matters enormously for the story we're about to tell, because a huge part of why people believe America has no ancient cities comes down to definitions that were built, mostly by European scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries, using European and Middle Eastern examples as the template. If a place didn't look like Rome or Babylon, it sometimes didn't get counted, even when it should have. Let's start with the most influential attempt to define a city scientifically. In 1950, an Australian archaeologist named V. Gordon Childe published a paper that became one of the most cited pieces of writing in the entire field. Childe had spent his career studying the transition from small farming villages to large complex societies in the ancient Near East, and he wanted to know what specifically separated a city from a village. He came up with a list of 10 traits, things like a dense population, full-time specialists who didn't farm, monumental public buildings, social classes, writing systems, and long-distance trade. Childe's list became something like scripture in archaeology classrooms for decades. The trouble is, he built it almost entirely from Mesopotamian evidence, places like Uruk and Ur, the cities that grew up along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers around 5,000 years ago. And when you build a definition from one set of examples, you end up with a definition that's really good at recognizing more examples that look like the first set, and not so good at recognizing things that developed differently. Here's where it gets interesting for our purposes. Several of Child's criteria, like writing, turn out to be optional, even by his own logic. The Inca built one of the largest states in the ancient world, controlling something like 10 million people across thousands of miles of the Andes, and they did it without a writing system in the conventional sense. They used a recording device called the quipu, a series of knotted cords that encoded numerical and possibly narrative information, and historians are still working out exactly how much information could be stored that way. The Inca had cities, roads, granaries, and an administrative bureaucracy that kept the whole system running. They just didn't write the way Sumerians did. If you treat writing as a hard requirement, you accidentally write the Inca out of the category of civilization, which is obviously absurd, but that's exactly what older textbooks sometimes did. So archaeologists today tend to use a softer, more flexible approach. Instead of asking whether a place checks every box on Child's list, they ask a more basic question. Does this place show evidence of a population large enough and organized enough that most people couldn't have known each other personally, and that required some form of centralized coordination to function? That's a much more useful test, because it can be applied anywhere in the world, regardless of whether the builders used stone or wood, writing or knotted string. Think about what that test actually requires in practice. You need evidence of population density, which archaeologists estimate from the size and number of house foundations packed into an area. You need evidence of food storage and distribution on a scale beyond what one family could manage. You need evidence of specialized labor, which shows up as a workshop here, a craftsman's tools there, signs that not everyone in the settlement was simply growing their own food. And you need some kind of public architecture, a structure built for the whole community rather than for one household. Here's a helpful way to picture it. Imagine you're an archaeologist 1,000 years from now, and all that survives of a modern American suburb is the foundations of houses, scattered metal and plastic fragments, and the occasional larger building like a school or a church. You wouldn't have records, you wouldn't have eyewitness accounts, you'd just have what's buried. Now imagine trying to figure out, from that evidence alone, how many people lived there, what they did for work, and whether they had a functioning society. That's the basic challenge of identifying ancient cities anywhere in the world, and it's an especially hard challenge in parts of the Americas, for reasons we'll get into over the next several chapters. There's a real-world example that shows how badly this can go wrong when archaeologists go in with the wrong assumptions. For much of the 20th century, scholars looking at the Amazon rainforest assumed it could never have supported large, complex societies. The reasoning seemed sound on the surface. Tropical rainforest soil is famously poor for farming, the climate is harsh, and surely a dense civilization would have left more obvious traces, like the pyramids or the Colosseum. This idea even had a name in academic circles, the idea that the Amazon was a pristine wilderness, untouched by significant human civilization before European contact. That assumption held for decades. Then, starting in the 2000s and accelerating sharply in the 2010s and 2020s, researchers using a remote sensing technology called lidar began mapping the forest floor from the air, cutting straight through the dense tree canopy that had hidden everything from ground-level survey teams for centuries. We'll spend a full chapter on lidar later in this script because it has genuinely rewritten the map of ancient America. But for now, the short version is this. Beneath that supposedly empty wilderness, researchers found earthworks, causeways, plazas, and settlement patterns suggesting populations in the hundreds of thousands across the Amazon basin, organized into networks of towns and ceremonial centers. The wilderness wasn't pristine. It had been built, farmed, and engineered by people for thousands of years, and then the forest grew back over what they left behind. That's the first major lesson of this whole story, and we'll return to it again and again. Absence of obvious ruins is not the same thing as absence of cities. Sometimes it just means the evidence is hiding, waiting for the right tool or the right question to bring it back into view. Now, here's a historical irony worth sitting with for a moment. The first Europeans to actually see some of these places with their own eyes were frequently astonished by what they found. Spanish soldiers who marched into the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519 described a city larger and cleaner than anything they'd seen back home in Spain, with causeways, canals, and a central market that one chronicler estimated drew tens of thousands of people on market days. We'll go deep into Tenochtitlan in a later chapter, because what happened to it afterward is one of the most dramatic acts of urban destruction in recorded history. But the point right now is simpler. The no ancient cities myth didn't come from a lack of evidence at the time of contact. Plenty of first-hand European witnesses described enormous, sophisticated cities. The myth came later, built up over centuries of selective memory, destroyed records, and a kind of historical convenience that served the people writing the history books. So why did the idea stick despite the eyewitness accounts? Several reasons start to surface once you look closely, and we'll unpack each of them across this script. Disease wiped out so much of the population, often before sustained European contact even happened, that later arrivals sometimes found landscapes that looked emptier than they had been just decades earlier. Building materials in many parts of the Americas were wood, adobe, and packed earth rather than the cut stone that survives for millennia in the Mediterranean world, so structures decayed faster and left less behind for later observers to marvel at. And there was, frankly, a motivated incentive for colonizers to describe the lands they were taking as empty or underused, because that framing made the taking seem more justifiable. Let's pause on that last point with an analogy, because it's an idea we'll come back to. Picture two real estate agents trying to sell the same plot of land. One says, "This property is currently occupied, developed, and has been continuously cared for by a family for generations." The other says, "This is an open lot, essentially raw land, ready for someone to come in and build something new." Those two descriptions can apply to the exact same physical place, but they tell completely different stories about who has a claim to it and what the person describing it wants you to think. A lot of early colonial writing about the Americas functioned the second way, whether the authors were being consciously dishonest or not. Land that had been farmed, settled, and built upon for thousands of years got described again and again as wilderness simply waiting to be discovered. The word discovery itself carries that bias baked right into it. You cannot discover a place that already has cities, roads, and people living their lives. You can only encounter it. We're going to spend real time later in this script on exactly how and why that framing took hold and persisted for so long, because it's a genuinely important piece of intellectual history, not just a side note. But for now, the goal of this chapter was narrower, to get the definition of city settled, and settled in a way that's fair to evidence from outside the Mediterranean world. Here's where that leaves us, and it's worth restating clearly before we move forward. A city, for the purposes of this script, is a settlement large and dense enough that most residents are strangers to each other, supported by organized food production and storage beyond the household level, featuring specialized labor outside of farming, and containing architecture built for the use of the whole community rather than for any one family. Writing is not required. Stone construction is not required. A particular population threshold is not even strictly required, because population estimates from archaeological evidence always come with a margin of error, sometimes a very large one, and reasonable scholars can and do disagree by tens of thousands of people on how large some ancient American cities actually were. What is required is evidence, and what we're about to discover over the rest of this script is that the Americas have plenty of it. Cities older than the pyramids of Giza. Cities larger at their peak than London or Paris at the same moment in history. Cities with engineering so advanced that modern hydrologists still study how they managed water. The myth says none of this happened here. The evidence says something very different. And it's been saying it for longer than most people realize. We just haven't always been listening in the right way or looking in the right places. That's exactly where we're headed next, starting with a site in coastal Peru that forces us to throw out one of the most basic assumptions people make about when civilization in the Americas actually began. If you'd asked most archaeologists in the 1960s where to find the oldest city in the Americas, they probably would have pointed you toward Mesoamerica, maybe the Olmec heartland, along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, and they would have given you a date somewhere around 1200 BCE. That was the textbook answer for a long time. It turned out to be off by more than 1,000 years, and the place that proved it wrong sits on a dry, wind-swept stretch of desert in coastal Peru, in a river valley most people outside of Andean archaeology had never heard of. The site is called Caral, sometimes written as Caral Supe, after the river valley it sits in, about 120 miles north of Lima. And the story of how it got properly dated is worth telling on its own, because it's a good example of how science sometimes corrects itself slowly, through patient, unglamorous work, rather than a single dramatic discovery. Peruvian archaeologists had actually known about Caral since the 1940s. They could see the mounds, the sunken circular plazas, the obvious signs of large-scale construction. But for decades, nobody assigned the site much importance, partly because there was almost no pottery at Caral, and pottery is one of the main tools archaeologists use to date a site through stylistic comparison with other known sites. No pottery suggested to many researchers that Caral simply wasn't very significant or very old. It looked, on the surface, like one ancient site among many in a region full of them. That assumption held until the late 1990s, when an archaeologist named Ruth Shady Solis, working with Peru's National Institute of Culture, began a serious excavation campaign at the site. Shady and her team sent organic material recovered from the site, including reed and woven fiber bags called shikras that had been used to carry stones during construction, to radiocarbon dating laboratories. The results, published in the journal Science in 2001, were startling enough to make international news. The dates came back to around 2600 BCE, with some evidence suggesting activity even earlier than that. That placed Caral as contemporary with the construction of the pyramids of Giza in Egypt, and older than the rise of Sumerian cities like Uruk, which most archaeologists had assumed had no real parallel anywhere else in the world at that early date. Let's sit with what that actually means, because it's easy to read past a date like 2600 BCE without feeling its weight. At that point in history, writing had only just been invented in Mesopotamia, and it hadn't spread anywhere else yet. The wheel was a brand new idea. Bronze tools were still rare. And on the opposite side of the planet, with no contact whatsoever between the two regions, people in a Peruvian river valley were independently organizing themselves into a society complex enough to plan and build monumental architecture. Caral's largest structure, a stepped platform mound now called the Pyramid Mayor, rises about 60 feet and covers a footprint roughly the size of 4 football fields. Building something that large requires more than ambition. It requires the ability to feed and house a workforce that isn't growing its own food while it works, which means surplus food production, organized labor, and someone or some group with the authority to direct that labor toward a shared project rather than each family fending for itself. That combination of traits is precisely what separates a city from a village, exactly the kind of evidence we discussed in the last chapter. Here's where the story gets even more interesting, because Caral wasn't an isolated curiosity. It was one node in a network. Archaeologists have since identified at least 18 other major sites in the Supi Valley and neighboring valleys, all dating to roughly the same period, suggesting a regional society with multiple urban centers rather than one lonely city standing alone in the desert. This entire cluster of sites is now referred to as the Norte Chico civilization, named for the region of Peru's north-central coast, where it developed, and it's widely considered the oldest known civilization in the Americas, and one of the oldest in the entire world, alongside Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. So how did people in a coastal desert manage to build something this ambitious, this early? The answer comes down to an unusual economic foundation, one that doesn't match the typical story of how early civilizations get started. The conventional model, built largely from the Fertile Crescent example, goes like this. Agriculture produces surplus grain. Surplus grain allows population growth and specialization. Specialization eventually produces cities. Caral seems to have developed along a somewhat different path, one anchored less in grain agriculture and more in the extraordinary productivity of the nearby Pacific Ocean. The waters off the coast of Peru sit along the Humboldt Current, one of the richest marine ecosystems on the planet, teeming with anchovies and other fish in numbers almost difficult to overstate even today. Inland, the Supi Valley itself wasn't well suited to staple grain crops, but it turned out to be excellent for growing cotton. Archaeologists found enormous quantities of cotton fiber and remnants of fishing nets at Caral, along with fish bones, suggesting that the people of the valley grew cotton, traded it to coastal fishing communities in exchange for the ocean's abundant catch, and built a stable food economy out of that exchange rather than out of grinding wheat or maize into bread. It's a reminder that there isn't just one template for how complex societies emerge. Different environments produce different solutions to the same underlying problem, which is how to feed enough people reliably enough that some of them can stop farming and start building, organizing, or specializing in something else. There's a useful analogy here if it helps to picture the difference. Imagine two neighborhoods, one built around a single large factory that produces one critical product everyone needs, the other built around several smaller businesses that all trade goods and services back and forth to meet the same needs collectively. Both neighborhoods can end up wealthy enough to build nice houses and public buildings. They just get there by different economic routes. Caral built its wealth through trade and specialization between valley and coast, rather than through a single dominant crop the way Mesopotamia did with barley and wheat. Caral also offers something genuinely rare in the archaeological record of early civilizations: a near-total absence of evidence for warfare. Excavators have found no defensive walls, no caches of weapons, no mass graves or skeletal trauma consistent with violent conflict, which stands in real contrast to many other early urban societies, where fortifications and weapons show up almost immediately in the archaeological record. Researchers, including Shady, have suggested that Caral society may have organized itself instead around shared ceremonial and religious activity, evidenced by the sunken circular plazas found at the site, structures that appear to have been used for communal gatherings, possibly with music. Excavators recovered dozens of flutes made from condor and pelican bones at the site, along with cornets made of deer and llama bone, suggesting that music played some meaningful role in the life of the city, whether in ceremony, celebration, or some combination we can't fully reconstruct from instruments alone. This is one of those places where honest uncertainty matters more than a tidy explanation. We know the flutes existed. We know the plazas were built for gathering. We don't know exactly what people did there, what they believed, or what specific rituals the architecture was designed to support, and archaeologists are careful not to overstate their confidence on that point. Why does any of this matter for the larger argument of this script? Because Caral demolishes one of the quiet assumptions buried inside the empty continent myth, the assumption that civilization arrived late to the Americas, trailing centuries or millennia behind the Old World, eventually catching up only shortly before European contact. Caral shows the opposite. Organized urban society, monumental architecture, and complex economic systems were present in the Americas at the same moment they were emerging in Egypt and Mesopotamia, developing independently, with no contact between the hemispheres at all. The clock didn't start late in the Americas. It started on roughly the same timeline, just somewhere most people never learned to look. It's also worth noting how recently this story came to light, because it says something important about how much we still don't know. The definitive radiocarbon dating that established Caral's age was published in 2001. That's not ancient scholarship rediscovered. That's recent enough that many people reading or listening to this right now were already adults when the world learned that one of its oldest civilizations had been sitting in plain sight in coastal Peru the entire time, simply waiting for the right dating technique and the right archaeologist to take it seriously. That pattern, evidence sitting quietly in plain sight until someone finally asks the right question of it, is going to come up again and again throughout this script. Caral was hiding behind a lack of pottery and a set of outdated assumptions about where early urban life could plausibly develop. Other sites we're about to explore were hiding behind dense jungle canopy, behind centuries of soil erosion, or behind the simple fact that nobody had bothered to look closely at land that everyone assumed was empty. Caral was just the first major piece of evidence to force a serious reconsideration. It would not be the last, and the next stop on this journey takes us north, away from the Andean coast, into the heart of what's now the United States, to a city built almost entirely of earth that, at its height, may have held more people than London did at the same moment in history. There's a spot just across the Mississippi River from downtown St. Louis where if you climb to the top of an enormous earthen mound and look out, you can see the city's modern skyline in the distance. It's a strange and genuinely moving juxtaposition once you understand what you're standing on, because that mound and the dozens of others scattered around it are the remains of a city that may have been the largest urban center north of Mexico for nearly 700 years. Most Americans drive past it without knowing it's there. It's called Cahokia, and it deserves to be one of the most famous archaeological sites in the country. Let's start with scale, because the numbers involved are easy to underestimate until you sit with them for a moment. At its peak, somewhere between roughly 1050 and 1200 CE, Cahokia covered close to 6 square miles and contained somewhere in the range of 120 mounds, the precise count varying depending on how erosion and later farming have obscured some of the smaller ones. Population estimates are genuinely contested among archaeologists, which is worth being upfront about, but credible estimates place the city's peak population somewhere between roughly 10,000 and 20,000 people, with some researchers arguing for figures even higher once you account for the surrounding settlements that were functionally part of Greater Cahokia rather than separate towns. For comparison, London in the year 1100 had a population usually estimated at somewhere around 15 to 18,000 people. Cahokia, in other words, was very plausibly in the same population class as one of medieval Europe's most important cities, built entirely from earth, wood, and thatch, with no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, and no draft animals to help move material. That last detail is worth pausing on because it changes how you should picture the construction process. The largest structure at the site, known today as Monk's Mound, named for a group of Trappist monks who briefly lived nearby in the early 19th century and had nothing to do with building it, rises about 100 feet and covers roughly 14 acres at its base, making it larger in footprint than the Great Pyramid of Giza, though considerably shorter. Excavations suggest it was built in stages over multiple generations, with workers carrying soil in woven baskets, basket load by basket load, packing and compacting each layer before adding the next. Archaeologists estimate that building Monk's Mound alone required moving something on the order of 22 million cubic feet of earth. There were no wheelbarrows, there were no oxen. Every bit of that material moved because human beings carried it on their backs or in baskets balanced on their hips, walking the same paths over and over across what was likely decades of sustained, organized labor. Try to picture that for a moment, not as a statistic, but as a daily reality. Generation after generation of people waking up, walking to a borrow pit somewhere outside the city, filling a basket with dirt, and carrying it back to add another layer to a mound that their grandparents had also worked on, and that their grandchildren would likely still be adding to. That's not the kind of project a loose collection of independent families undertakes on a whim. It requires planning that spans decades, a recognized authority capable of organizing and motivating that labor, and a stable enough food supply that thousands of people could be fed while spending a meaningful portion of their time on construction rather than farming. All the markers of urban civilization we talked about in Chapter 1 are present here, just built from a different palette of materials than the stone architecture most people associate with ancient cities. So, what fed all those people? The Mississippian world, the broader cultural network of which Cahokia was the largest and most prominent center, was built on an agricultural foundation centered on maize, the same crop that anchored most of the major civilizations of ancient Mesoamerica. Maize had spread north from Mexico over the preceding centuries, gradually adapting to different climates as it moved. And by the time Cahokia rose to prominence, intensive maize farming in the rich floodplain soil of the Mississippi and Illinois River confluence area was producing enough surplus to support a genuinely urban population. This is a useful example of something we touched on in the last chapter. Different regions of the Americas developed their own versions of the same basic story: agricultural surplus enabling specialization, enabling cities, but each region got there through its own specific crops, environment, and timeline. Caral built its foundation on cotton and coastal fish. Cahokia built its foundation on maize farming in one of the most fertile river floodplains on the continent. Cahokia's location wasn't an accident, and understanding why the site was chosen tells you something about how sophisticated Mississippian planning really was. The city sits near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, a junction point that put it at the center of an enormous potential trade network reaching from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes and from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachians. Archaeologists have recovered materials at Cahokia that simply don't occur naturally anywhere nearby, including copper from the Great Lakes region, mica from the southern Appalachians, marine shell from the Gulf Coast, and a particular type of stone for tool-making that originated hundreds of miles away. That kind of material diversity doesn't happen by accident. It happens because a place has become a genuine hub, pulling in goods and probably people from an enormous geographic radius, the same way a modern city becomes a hub for trade simply by sitting at the right crossroads of rivers, roads, or rail lines. One of the most striking discoveries at Cahokia is a massive timber circle archaeologists nicknamed Woodhenge because of its obvious functional parallel to Stonehenge, even though the two sites share no historical connection whatsoever. Multiple versions of this structure were built and rebuilt over time, consisting of large wooden posts set in a circle of a specific diameter. When researchers studied the alignment of these posts relative to the rising sun and to nearby mounds, they found that certain posts marked the position of sunrise on the solstices and equinoxes with real precision. This tells us something important and easy to overlook. Cahokia's builders weren't simply moving dirt and building structures by guesswork. They were tracking the solar year carefully enough to encode that knowledge directly into the layout of their city, almost certainly for both practical agricultural reasons, knowing when to plant and harvest, and ceremonial or religious reasons tied to seasonal festivals and rituals that we can only partially reconstruct from the archaeological record. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge a genuine area of scholarly debate in keeping with the honesty this whole project demands. Archaeologists do not agree on exactly how Cahokia was governed. Some researchers argue for a fairly centralized, almost monarchical form of leadership, pointing to evidence like a notable burial found beneath one of the mounds containing an individual laid out on a bed of thousands of carefully arranged shell beads, accompanied by sacrificial offerings, including, controversially, the remains of other people interpreted by some researchers as retainers or sacrificial victims, suggesting an individual of immense social status, possibly even something like sacred kingship. Other archaeologists push back against this interpretation, arguing that Mississippian society may have been organized more around kinship networks, ritual specialists, and council-based decision-making distributed across multiple elite families, rather than concentrated in a single ruling figure. This debate hasn't been resolved, and it's a good example of one of the rules we committed to at the start of this whole project. Where genuine uncertainty exists among experts, we say so, rather than picking the more dramatic story and presenting it as settled fact. What we do know with much greater confidence is that Cahokia eventually declined and was largely abandoned, sometime around the 13th or 14th century, well over 100 years before any European set foot in North America. The reasons for that decline are themselves debated and very likely involve multiple overlapping causes rather than one single dramatic event. Some researchers point to environmental strain, evidence suggesting that the dense population around Cahokia may have deforested the surrounding landscape for fuel and construction material, leading to increased flooding and soil erosion that would have damaged the agricultural base the city depended on. Others point to climatic shifts associated with a period sometimes called the Little Ice Age, which began affecting global temperatures starting in the 13th century and could plausibly have shortened growing seasons in the region. Still others suggest social and political instability, perhaps strain from supporting such a large population concentrated in one place, or conflict between elite factions. The honest answer is that Cahokia's decline was probably not caused by any single one of these factors operating alone, but by some combination of environmental pressure and social stress reinforcing each other over time, the kind of slow unraveling that's much harder to pin to one cause than a single dramatic collapse would be. This matters enormously for the larger story this script is telling, because Cahokia's decline happened on its own timeline, driven by its own internal dynamics, centuries before Europeans arrived anywhere near the Mississippi Valley. By the time French explorers reached the region in the late 17th century, Cahokia had already been an abandoned set of mysterious earthen mounds for roughly 300 to 400 years, longer ago than the founding of the United States is from today. The people the French encountered living in the broader region had their own oral traditions and their own relationship to the mounds, but the city itself, in its urban heyday, was already ancient history by the time European settlement began. This created exactly the kind of confusion we'll keep encountering throughout this script. When settlers and later American farmers found these enormous earthworks, many simply assumed indigenous peoples couldn't have built them, attributing them instead to a supposed lost race of mound builders, perhaps Vikings or refugees from Atlantis, or some other vanished civilization entirely disconnected from the native peoples living in the region at the time. This idea, sometimes called the myth of the mound builders, was eventually and decisively disproven through careful 19th and 20th century archaeology. But it persisted in popular American thought for a remarkably long time, and it's a clear example of exactly the kind of historical bias we flagged back in Chapter 1. The reflexive assumption that indigenous peoples of the Americas simply weren't capable of building monumental architecture, even when the evidence was sitting in massive earthen mounds in plain view across the Midwest and Southeast. Cahokia was the largest city in the Mississippian world, but it was very far from the only one. Related mound-building societies sharing similar religious symbolism, similar maize-based agriculture, and similar settlement patterns stretched across what's now the American Southeast and Midwest, from Georgia and Alabama up through Tennessee and into the Ohio Valley. Sites like Moundville in Alabama and Etowah in Georgia show many of the same hallmarks: regional centers with substantial mounds, evidence of long-distance trade, and clear social stratification, even if none reached quite the scale that Cahokia achieved at its height. Together, these sites represent a genuinely continental network of urban and ceremonial centers, one that simply built in a material that doesn't survive the way carved stone does, which brings us directly to the question we need to tackle next. Why does wood and packed earth disappear from the landscape so much faster than stone, and how much of the no ancient cities myth comes down to nothing more complicated than that basic difference in building materials? There's a question worth asking directly, because it sits underneath almost everything we've covered so far. If Cahokia really held as many people as London did at the same point in history, why does Rome still have a Colosseum you can walk through, while Cahokia is a set of grass-covered hills that most visitors mistake for a city park? The two cities existed at comparable scales, supported comparable populations, and both eventually declined. But one left behind something you can stand inside today: marble columns and concrete domes still standing after 2,000 years, while the other left behind dirt. That difference isn't really about how advanced or sophisticated either society was. It's mostly about something much more basic: what they happened to build with. Let's get the physics of this clear first, because it explains almost everything else in this chapter. Stone, particularly the kinds of limestone, granite, and marble used in classical Mediterranean architecture, is chemically and structurally stable across enormous spans of time. Left alone, a cut block of limestone can survive for thousands of years with relatively modest erosion, especially in a dry climate. Wood is a different story entirely. Wood is an organic material, and organic materials are exactly what fungi, insects, and bacteria are built to break down. A wooden post set into the ground in a temperate, humid climate like the American Midwest or Southeast will typically begin rotting within years, not centuries, unless something unusual intervenes to preserve it, like being submerged in oxygen-poor mud or charred and then sealed away from moisture and air. This is genuinely the most important single factor behind why some ancient cities are tourist attractions today, and others are essentially invisible without expert knowledge and modern technology. It has very little to do with which society was more advanced, and everything to do with what raw materials sat nearby and what construction tradition each culture inherited. Think about it from the perspective of an ancient builder rather than a modern observer with the benefit of hindsight. If you're planning a major construction project in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Mediterranean basin, you have ready access to abundant, easily quarried stone, and you're working in a generally dry climate that helps stone structures last even longer once built. If you're planning a major construction project in the Mississippi River Valley, your region is covered in rich alluvial soil and extensive hardwood forest. But useful building stone is comparatively scarce and often far away, while excellent timber and the raw material for packed earth construction sit immediately at hand. You build with what's actually available and practical, the same way builders everywhere in history have always done. Nobody hauls stone 500 miles when wood and earth that work perfectly well for your purposes are growing in your backyard. Here's an analogy that might help make this click. Imagine two different time capsules buried by two different communities, each meant to preserve something important for the future. One community seals their message inside a block of solid granite. The other writes their message on a piece of paper and buries it in a cardboard box. 1,000 years later, someone digs up the granite capsule and reads the message perfectly. They dig in the spot where the cardboard box should be, and they find nothing but a slightly different color of soil where the box used to sit, the paper and cardboard having long since decomposed into nothing detectable to the naked eye. Does that mean the second community's message was less important or less sophisticated, or that perhaps they never wrote anything down at all? Obviously not. It just means their container didn't survive the way granite does. Cahokia's mounds are themselves a kind of impressive engineering achievement, layers of carefully selected and compacted soil types that took real expertise to build correctly so they wouldn't collapse or erode. But the buildings that once stood on top of those mounds, made of wooden posts, woven cane walls, and thatched roofs, are almost entirely gone, leaving us only the post holes where those wooden frames once stood. This is exactly why archaeologists at Cahokia and similar sites can tell you with real confidence where buildings used to stand, sometimes even their approximate dimensions, and the layout of an entire plaza, despite the actual wooden structures having vanished completely centuries ago. When a wooden post is set into the ground and eventually rots away, it leaves behind a slightly different soil texture and color in the shape of that post, what archaeologists call a post hole. By carefully excavating in thin, controlled layers and mapping every soil discoloration across a site, researchers can reconstruct entire building footprints, sometimes even entire town plans, from nothing but the ghostly outlines left behind in the dirt after the original wood disappeared. It requires extraordinary patience and extremely careful excavation technique, and it produces real defensible knowledge. But it requires real expert work to recover, work that a casual visitor walking across the same field would never notice, whereas a stone temple announces its own existence to literally anyone who walks past it, expert or not. Now compare this to what happened with Mesoamerican civilizations, where building traditions actually varied considerably depending on the specific culture and period, which is an important nuance worth getting right, rather than oversimplifying. The Maya and the people of Teotihuacan, who we'll explore in detail over the next 2 chapters, did build extensively in cut stone for their major temples, palaces, and pyramids, which is part of why those sites left behind such visually dramatic ruins that 19th century explorers found so striking when they encountered them in the jungle. But even there, the vast majority of ordinary housing across Mesoamerica was built from wattle and daub, a technique using a woven lattice of wooden sticks covered in mud or clay, topped with thatched roofing, the same basic technique used in parts of the ancient Mediterranean world and, frankly, in vernacular architecture across much of the pre-modern world generally. That means even in places we strongly associate with monumental stone architecture, like the Maya region, the everyday residential city, the part where most people actually live their daily lives, has mostly vanished, leaving behind only the temples and palaces of the elite, which can create a skewed impression of what the city actually looked like and how many people actually lived there, since the housing of ordinary residents simply didn't survive the way the religious and administrative stone buildings did. There's a particularly important and often overlooked piece of this story specific to North America, which is the genuinely catastrophic impact that 19th and 20th century farming had on earthen mound sites. Cahokia was extraordinarily lucky compared to many other mound sites across the Midwest and Southeast in the sense that significant portions of it survived long enough to eventually be protected. Countless other mounds were not so fortunate. As American agriculture industrialized through the 18 and 1900s, Farmers across the Mississippi Valley and the Southeast routinely plowed directly through ancient mounds that stood in the way of efficient field cultivation, gradually flattening them year after year of plowing, or simply removed them outright with mechanical equipment to clear land for crops. Some mounds were deliberately leveled because landowners assumed, often incorrectly, and sometimes due to the myth of the mound builders we discussed in the previous chapter, that they held no historical or cultural significance worth preserving. Archaeologists studying historical land records and early survey maps from the 19th century have documented thousands of mounds recorded by early surveyors that no longer exist today, destroyed gradually through agricultural activity, urban construction, or simple disregard, often well before professional archaeology had developed the tools or the cultural standing to intervene and document them properly before they disappeared. This represents a genuinely different kind of erasure from the simple biodegradability we started this chapter with, and it's worth being precise about the distinction. Wood rotting away over centuries is decay, a natural and largely unavoidable physical process. A farmer in 1890 deliberately plowing through 1,000-year-old earthwork because nobody had explained to him what it represented, or because indigenous historical memory had been deliberately suppressed and devalued by the broader society around him, is a different kind of loss entirely, one driven by human choices, social attitudes, and what people had been taught, or more often not taught, to value and protect. Both processes contributed to the same overall outcome, ancient American cities being far less visible today than their genuine historical scale would suggest. But they're not the same phenomenon, and conflating them risks letting the second, more avoidable kind of loss hide behind the first, purely natural one. There's a useful real-world parallel from outside the Americas that helps put this whole dynamic in proper perspective, because it shows the pattern isn't unique to this hemisphere at all. Throughout much of historical Japan, traditional architecture relied heavily on wood rather than stone, partly due to the country's significant earthquake activity, since flexible wooden construction tends to survive seismic shaking considerably better than rigid stone structures do. As a direct result, very few of Japan's oldest buildings survive in their truly original physical material today. Instead, many of the country's most historically significant structures, including famous Shinto shrines like Isejingu, have been deliberately and ritually rebuilt at fixed intervals for many centuries, using the same techniques, the same design, and often timber harvested in the same traditional way, but using entirely new physical wood each time. Nobody studying Japanese history concludes from this practice that Japan therefore lacks ancient architectural traditions. Scholars correctly understand the continuity as residing in the design, the technique, and the unbroken cultural practice itself, rather than demanding it reside specifically in one single physical, unchanging object surviving continuously across the centuries. Yet when it comes to the Americas, that same generous, contextually aware logic somehow rarely gets applied with the same consistency. A wooden city that decayed and was rebuilt repeatedly over centuries, the way Cahokia almost certainly was, as mounds were periodically enlarged and structures replaced, gets treated by the popular imagination as evidence of impermanence or even cultural primitiveness, rather than evidence of a different, equally valid and sophisticated architectural tradition adapted intelligently to locally available materials and to a genuinely different climate and environment than the Mediterranean basin. So where does this leave the broader argument we're building across this whole script? Building material turns out to be one of the single most powerful and most frequently underestimated explanations for why certain ancient American cities remain comparatively invisible in popular historical memory, while others, ironically the ones built from stone, became famous tourist destinations almost as soon as outside explorers rediscovered them. It's not a question of which society achieved more, or which civilization was somehow more advanced or sophisticated than another. It's a fairly mundane and ultimately just physical question of which raw materials decay, and which ones, left mostly alone, simply do not. But material alone doesn't explain everything we're trying to understand here, not by a long stretch. Because some of the most visually dramatic, unmistakably stone-built cities in the entire Western Hemisphere also sat hidden and largely unknown to the outside world for centuries after their builders abandoned them, swallowed not by decay this time, but by dense jungle growth. And one of those cities is so genuinely enormous and so persistently mysterious, even to the archaeologists who've spent entire careers studying it, that the later Aztec people who eventually encountered its ruins centuries after it was originally built assumed, understandably, that it must have been constructed by actual giants or perhaps by gods themselves. That's exactly where we're headed next. There is something genuinely unusual about the way this next city enters the historical record, because the people most famous for ruling the region where it sits, the Aztecs, didn't build it, didn't know who did build it, and were themselves looking at its ruins with the same sense of awe and mystery that visitors feel today. When the Aztecs encountered the abandoned city about 30 miles northeast of what would become Mexico City, it had already been deserted for roughly 700 years. They gave it the name we still use, Teotihuacan, generally translated as something like the place where the gods were born, or the place of those who have the road of the gods. They built shrines there. They made pilgrimages to it. They told stories about it being the site where the sun and moon were created. And they had absolutely no idea who had actually built it, because by the time the Aztecs rose to power, that knowledge had already been lost for longer than the gap separating us today from the founding of the United States. That detail alone should reshape how you think about the timeline of American history. Most people, if they've heard of Aztec ruins at all, imagine one continuous civilization stretching back into deep antiquity. The reality is closer to layers of an archaeological cake with entirely different societies rising, building, declining, and being replaced by later societies who often knew remarkably little about the people who came before them, sometimes treating earlier ruins with the same mixture of reverence and confusion that a modern visitor might feel standing in front of Stonehenge. So let's establish what we actually know about Teotihuacan itself, separate from the later Aztec mythology surrounding it. The city was founded sometime around 100 BCE, grew rapidly over the following centuries, and reached its peak between roughly 100 and 600 CE, making it broadly contemporary with the height of the Roman Empire on the other side of the planet, with no contact whatsoever between the two civilizations. At its height, most archaeological estimates place Teotihuacan's population somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people, with some researchers arguing for figures toward the higher end of that range or even somewhat beyond it. To put that in perspective, that made Teotihuacan one of the largest cities anywhere on Earth at the time, plausibly among the 6 or so largest urban centers in the entire world during its peak, in the same general league as Rome itself. The scale of the architecture matches that population. The city is organized around a central avenue that Spanish colonizers, arriving roughly 9 centuries after the city's collapse, later named the Avenue of the Dead, based on a mistaken assumption that the platforms lining it were tombs. They weren't tombs. They were residential and ceremonial platforms, but the name stuck anyway, and it's still what the avenue is called today. That avenue runs for about 1.5 miles, anchored at one end by the Pyramid of the Moon, and dominated along its length by the Pyramid of the Sun, a structure roughly 230 feet tall, with a base covering an area comparable to the Great Pyramid of Giza, though somewhat shorter in overall height. Building something on that scale, again using no metal tools, no wheeled transport, and no draft animals, required an organizational capacity and a sustained multi-generational labor commitment fully comparable to anything achieved in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. Here's where Teotihuacan becomes genuinely distinctive compared to many other ancient cities we've discussed so far, and it's a detail that consistently surprises people who only know the city by its famous pyramids. Teotihuacan wasn't simply a ceremonial center surrounded by scattered villages. It was, by most reasonable definitions, a true metropolis, with the overwhelming majority of its population living in substantial, multi-family apartment compounds built directly within the city itself. Archaeologists have identified roughly 2,000 of these apartment compounds spread across the urban area, structures that typically housed multiple families together, organized around shared central courtyards, often built with surprisingly consistent architectural standards across the entire city, suggesting some degree of centralized urban planning rather than purely organic, unplanned growth. This is worth dwelling on for a moment because it's a genuinely striking parallel to modern urban life that people don't expect from a city this old. Picture a contemporary apartment building where unrelated families live in separate units within the same structure, sharing common walls, courtyards, and basic infrastructure while still maintaining their own private domestic space. Teotihuacan's residential compounds functioned in a recognizably similar way, just built from adobe brick and volcanic stone rather than steel and concrete, nearly 2,000 years before modern apartment living became commonplace anywhere else in the world. Excavations within these residential compounds have also revealed something that significantly complicates the simple picture of Teotihuacan as one single, culturally unified society. Archaeologists have identified distinct neighborhoods within the city that show clear evidence of foreign cultural influence, most famously, a district that appears to have housed a community connected to Oaxaca in southern Mexico, based on the distinctive pottery, burial customs, and even a Zapotec-style tomb found in that specific area, all noticeably different from typical Teotihuacan practice elsewhere in the city. There is also substantial evidence of a significant Maya presence within the city, and Teotihuacan imagery and stylistic influence shows up at Maya sites located hundreds of miles away, indicating sustained long-distance contact, trade, and very possibly political influence flowing in both directions between Teotihuacan and the Maya world we'll be exploring in the next chapter. This tells us Teotihuacan functioned as something genuinely cosmopolitan for its era, a true multi-ethnic metropolis pulling in people, goods, and ideas from across a huge swath of Mesoamerica, in some ways comparable to how ancient Rome absorbed and incorporated peoples from across the entire Mediterranean world into one sprawling, complicated urban center. So who actually built and ran this enormous, multicultural city? This is the point where honest scholarly uncertainty needs to take center stage, because it's genuinely one of the most significant unanswered questions in all of Mesoamerican archaeology. Unlike most of the other major civilizations we'll be discussing throughout this script, Teotihuacan left behind essentially no deciphered written language identifying its rulers, no king lists, no royal portraits with accompanying names carved into stone, the way Maya cities typically recorded their dynasties. Archaeologists have found symbolic and pictorial elements that may carry some linguistic meaning, but nothing has been definitively decoded as a coherent written language naming specific historical individuals. We don't know the name of a single Teotihuacan ruler. We don't know with certainty what specific ethnic or linguistic group founded the city, though competing theories point toward possible connections to speakers of an early form of the Nahuatl language family, or alternatively, the Totonac or Mixozoic language groups. And the genuine answer may well be that the city's population was simply too diverse and cosmopolitan from very early on for any single ethnic or linguistic label to neatly apply to the whole urban population. This absence of named rulers stands in sharp, almost striking contrast to many other major Mesoamerican civilizations, and it raises a genuinely interesting question about how Teotihuacan might have been governed. Some archaeologists have proposed that the city may have been ruled through some form of collective leadership, perhaps a council representing different powerful family lineages or institutional offices, rather than the more familiar model of a single, semi-divine king, commemorated prominently and individually in stone, the way we see at most Maya cities. This remains a genuine area of active scholarly debate and ongoing research, rather than a settled conclusion, and it's worth being clear about that distinction. We are not certain. We can describe the pattern of evidence and the leading interpretations researchers have proposed to explain it, but anyone claiming definitive certainty about Teotihuacan's exact system of government would be overstating what the current archaeological evidence can actually support. Teotihuacan's decline is similarly debated, though the broad outline is reasonably well established through layered, converging evidence. Sometime around 550 to 650 CE, the city experienced what appears to have been a violent and deliberately targeted internal upheaval. Excavators have found clear evidence that many of the most significant monuments and elite residences along the central Avenue of the Dead were deliberately and systematically burned, while ordinary residential apartment compounds in other parts of the city appear to have remained largely untouched by this destruction. That specific pattern, targeted burning, concentrated heavily on elite and ceremonial structures rather than general, indiscriminate destruction spread evenly across the whole city, strongly suggests an internal uprising directed specifically against the ruling elite, rather than an external invasion by some outside foreign army. Some researchers have connected this internal collapse to broader environmental stress, including evidence of a regional drought that may have placed severe pressure on the city's enormous population and its underlying agricultural support system, creating exactly the kind of social tension that has toppled centralized governments throughout human history, in the Americas and very much elsewhere as well. This pattern, prosperity straining against environmental limits until the whole system finally fractures under pressure, is one we're going to encounter again in considerably more dramatic form when we turn next to the Maya world. It's also a pattern with an uncomfortable contemporary resonance worth noting briefly, though without overstating any direct, simplistic equivalence between ancient societies and our own modern circumstances. Complex societies throughout history have repeatedly discovered that environmental limits, once seriously exceeded for long enough, eventually demand to be paid, one way or another, regardless of how sophisticated or seemingly secure that particular society's engineering, administration, or accumulated wealth might otherwise have appeared at its peak. Here's the detail that brings this chapter's central theme full circle, the one we opened with. By the time the Aztecs rose to real political power in the region, during the 14 and 1500s, Teotihuacan had already been substantially abandoned and in ruins for roughly 7 to 8 centuries. That's a genuinely enormous span of time. It's comparable, in raw chronological distance, to the gap separating us today from the early Crusades. The Aztecs, who walked among those crumbling pyramids and conducted their own religious pilgrimages, there were encountering a civilization every bit as ancient and mysterious to them as Teotihuacan feels to a modern visitor walking the same grounds today. They were, in a very real sense, ancient history tourists themselves, standing in the ruins of a vanished metropolis and constructing their own creation myths to help explain who must have built such an extraordinary place, because the actual historical answer had already been lost to them centuries before their own empire even existed. This should genuinely reshape how we picture the deeper history of Mesoamerica as a whole. It wasn't one long, unbroken civilization, gradually evolving in a straight line from antiquity all the way through to the Spanish conquest. It was multiple distinct civilizations, rising, building extraordinary and genuinely lasting achievements, declining for reasons that were sometimes environmental, sometimes political, sometimes a complicated tangle of both at once, and then in some cases being almost entirely forgotten by the very people who eventually settled and lived among their abandoned ruins centuries later. Teotihuacan rose, thrived for centuries, collapsed, and was already a deep historical mystery to the Aztecs themselves, who arrived on the scene roughly 700 years after the city's prime, found these unmistakably enormous pyramids standing in the landscape, and had no working knowledge whatsoever of who had actually built them or why. That same basic pattern, in some ways, also describes the Maya world we're about to explore next, a civilization that built its greatest cities deep within dense tropical rainforest, reached extraordinary heights of mathematical, astronomical, and architectural sophistication, and then experienced a genuine civilizational collapse so significant, and in certain regions so comparatively sudden, that explaining exactly why it happened remains one of the most actively debated and contested questions in the entire field of archaeology today. In 1839, an American travel writer named John Lloyd Stephens and an English artist named Frederick Catherwood hacked their way through dense jungle in what's now Honduras, following rumors of ruins that local guides had described to them. What they found at a site called Copan stopped them in their tracks. Stone monuments carved with intricate, unfamiliar hieroglyphs, stepped pyramids rising out of the tree cover, plazas laid out with obvious deliberate planning, now choked with vines and root systems that had spent centuries slowly prying the stonework apart. Stephens wrote about the experience with genuine wonder, and his subsequent book, illustrated with Catherwood's remarkably detailed engravings, introduced much of the English-speaking world to the Maya civilization for the first time. Here's the detail that matters most for our purposes, the one that should stop you cold the same way it stopped Stephens. He wasn't discovering a hidden secret that nobody had ever known about. He was rediscovering a civilization that had built some of the most sophisticated cities in the ancient world, cities that had thrived, declined, and in many cases already been abandoned for the jungle to reclaim, centuries before any European had any reason to know they existed. The forest hadn't just grown around these cities, in the most literal physical sense, it had eaten them. The Maya civilization is genuinely one of the longest continuously developing civilizations anywhere on Earth, with roots stretching back to at least 2000 BCE and cultural continuity, through enormous changes and upheavals all the way to the present day. The Maya people never actually vanished, despite a persistent and frustratingly common misconception suggesting otherwise. Millions of Maya people live across southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras today, many still speaking Mayan languages and maintaining traditions with deep roots in this ancient past. What collapsed dramatically and in ways archaeologists are still working to fully explain wasn't the Maya people themselves. It was a particular political and urban system concentrated heavily in the southern lowlands that had reached an extraordinary peak of complexity and then broke apart within a relatively compressed window of time. Let's get a sense of scale before we get to the collapse, because the achievement itself deserves real attention on its own terms. During what archaeologists call the Classic Period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, the Maya lowlands supported dozens of substantial city-states, each typically centered on a royal dynasty, a network of monumental temples and palaces, and a surrounding population of farmers supporting the urban core. Tikal, in what's now Guatemala, is among the most thoroughly studied and probably reached a population in the range of 60 to 90,000 people at its height, concentrated in an urban core surrounded by a much larger zone of dense rural settlement. Calakmul, its great rival to the north, may have controlled an even larger network of allied and subordinate cities at certain points during their long, intermittent rivalry. Across the broader Maya lowlands as a whole, recent research using the lidar technology we'll examine in detail in a later chapter has suggested total regional populations considerably higher than archaeologists assumed even 20 years ago, in some assessments reaching into the millions of people across the full extent of Maya territory during the Classic Period peak. What makes Maya civilization particularly remarkable and genuinely distinct from every other society we've discussed so far in this script is the sheer intellectual sophistication documented directly in their own writing. Unlike Teotihuacan, where we have no deciphered written language and don't even know the names of individual rulers, the Maya developed a fully functional, complex writing system combining logographic symbols representing whole words with syllabic symbols representing sounds, similar in basic structural logic to how Japanese writing today combines logographic kanji characters with phonetic syllabaries. Maya scribes used this system to record dynastic histories, military campaigns, royal marriages, and astronomical observations directly onto stone monuments, painted ceramics, and books made of bark paper called codices, the vast majority of which were later destroyed during the Spanish colonial period. A deliberate act of cultural erasure we'll examine more closely in a later chapter focused specifically on colonial destruction. The astronomical sophistication on display in what writing does survive is genuinely remarkable by any global historical standard. Maya astronomers tracked the orbital cycle of Venus with an accuracy of within about 2 hours over a span of nearly 500 years, achieved using nothing but sustained, careful, naked-eye observation recorded faithfully over many successive generations, with no telescopes, no precision mechanical instruments, nothing beyond patient, disciplined watching of the sky combined with a sophisticated mathematical system for recording and projecting forward what they observed. Their calendar system was similarly intricate, weaving together multiple separate, simultaneously running cycles, including a 260-day ritual calendar and a 365-day solar calendar, which only realign with each other once every 52 years, alongside an entirely separate long count system capable of tracking dates across enormous spans of time extending many thousands of years into the past or future. The Maya also developed and used the mathematical concept of zero as an actual placeholder value within their number system, achieved independently and apparently somewhat earlier than the development of the same concept in India, a civilization usually credited as the primary independent origin point for zero within most conventional accounts of the history of mathematics. This is exactly the kind of intuition-first mathematical achievement worth pausing on for a moment, because the concept of zero feels almost too obvious to qualify as a major discovery once you already know it. Yet a genuinely significant number of historically important number systems, including the Roman numeral system widely used across the classical Mediterranean world, simply never developed an equivalent placeholder concept at all, which created real, persistent, practical limitations on the kinds of calculations those societies could perform with any real efficiency. Now we arrive at the central, genuinely contested mystery of Maya history. What caused the so-called classic Maya collapse? Beginning around 800 CE and accelerating sharply through the following century, city after city across the southern lowlands stopped erecting new, dated monuments, stopped undertaking major new construction projects, and in many documented cases were substantially or completely depopulated within just a few generations. This wasn't a single cataclysmic event happening everywhere at once, the way a single sudden disaster might unfold. It was instead a complex, geographically uneven cascade, with some cities collapsing earlier and others holding on for considerably longer, and crucially, the northern Maya cities in the Yucatan Peninsula, places like Chichen Itza, actually continued thriving and building for centuries after most of the great southern lowland cities had already been abandoned. which tells us immediately that whatever happened wasn't a single uniform cause striking the entire Maya world identically and all at the same time. So what actually drove this collapse? Archaeologists have proposed several major contributing factors, and the genuinely honest current consensus, reflecting real ongoing scholarly debate rather than settled certainty, is that multiple factors most likely combined and reinforced each other rather than any single cause acting entirely alone. Drought evidence has become increasingly significant and compelling in recent decades, drawn from detailed analysis of lake sediment cores and cave formations across the Maya region, which together provide a genuinely robust, independently corroborated record of historical rainfall patterns stretching back many centuries. This evidence points toward a series of severe, sustained droughts striking the Maya lowlands during roughly the same period the collapse was unfolding, in some cases representing the driest multi-decade stretches the region had experienced in many centuries. For a civilization as heavily dependent on reliable seasonal rainfall for intensive maize agriculture as the classic Maya cities were, especially in regions lacking permanent rivers and therefore relying substantially on elaborately engineered reservoirs to capture and store seasonal rainfall for use during the dry months, a sustained multi-decade drought would have placed genuinely severe stress on the underlying food supply system that the entire urban population structure ultimately depended upon for its day-to-day survival. Environmental degradation caused directly by the Maya themselves likely compounded this climatic stress considerably. Dense urban populations require enormous quantities of wood, both for everyday construction and, very significantly, for fuel used in the production of lime plaster, an essential building material used extensively to surface Maya temples, palaces, and plaza floors throughout the southern lowlands. Producing lime plaster at the kind of sustained, massive scale the classic Maya cities clearly required involves intensively burning enormous quantities of wood at very high, sustained temperatures. Some researchers studying the broader regional environmental record have proposed that centuries of this kind of sustained deforestation, driven by ongoing construction and fuel demands, may have measurably altered regional rainfall patterns and contributed meaningfully to soil erosion, problems that would have made the underlying agricultural system considerably more fragile and vulnerable at precisely the moment when external drought conditions were placing it under additional simultaneous stress. Political fragmentation and increasing warfare between competing city-states represent a third significant strand of explanation that the evidence strongly supports. Unlike some of the other civilizations we've examined in this script, the Maya lowlands were never unified under one single centralized empire. They instead consisted of numerous independent, frequently rival city-states, engaged in shifting and often genuinely complex patterns of alliance, vassalage, and periodic open warfare against one another over multiple centuries. Hieroglyphic inscriptions recovered from numerous sites document an apparent significant intensification of warfare during the specific period leading directly into the broader collapse, including direct textual and physical evidence of cities being conquered, defaced, and in some documented cases having their ruling dynasties violently and permanently terminated. A reasonable, well-supported synthesis many archaeologists now favor suggests that worsening drought conditions likely intensified competition between increasingly desperate city-states for shrinking agricultural land and dwindling available resources, which in turn drove escalating warfare, which then further disrupted trade networks and agricultural production, creating a genuinely vicious, mutually reinforcing cycle that gradually but persistently worsened across multiple successive generations rather than collapsing in any single sudden moment. It's important to be genuinely clear about what we don't yet know with real confidence, in keeping with the standard of honesty we've committed to throughout this entire project. We don't know the precise relative weight that should be assigned to each of these contributing factors. We don't fully understand why certain specific cities collapsed earlier than others in the broader sequence, while some geographically nearby neighboring cities managed to persist for considerably longer under what appear to have been broadly similar regional conditions. And we don't have anything close to a single, simple, universally agreed-upon answer that neatly and definitively explains the entire collapse from start to finish. What we have instead is a genuinely sophisticated, multi-causal picture that has been built up gradually and carefully over many decades of patient research, combining archaeological excavation, the decipherment of hieroglyphic inscriptions, and increasingly precise paleoclimate science, each contributing its own separate strand of evidence to the larger overall picture. Here's where this connects directly back to the central argument running throughout this whole script. The popular imagination tends to encounter the Maya collapse and walk away with a strange, fundamentally mistaken impression that this was somehow evidence of a relatively primitive or fragile civilization that simply couldn't sustain itself for very long. The actual reality is essentially the exact opposite. The Maya built and sustained an extraordinarily sophisticated civilization with genuine breakthroughs in mathematics, astronomy, monumental architecture, and political organization for well over 1,000 consecutive years, a run considerably longer than the entire history of the United States to date, and arguably longer than many individual European nation-states have existed in anything resembling their current recognizable form. When that particular system did eventually face a serious, sustained, compounding set of environmental and political pressures, it experienced genuine, serious strain, much the way any sufficiently complex human society inevitably would when faced with comparable, sustained, multi-front stress. That isn't really a story about primitiveness or fundamental fragility at all. It's a sobering, genuinely universal story about the real limits of complexity itself. A cautionary lesson that applies with full force to any civilization in any era, including quite plausibly our own. And then the jungle did what jungles in this particular climate always eventually do once sustained, intensive human maintenance stops. Without thousands of farmers actively clearing land and maintaining cleared spaces, without the constant labor required to keep plazas swept clean and temple steps clear of encroaching vegetation, the forest reclaimed the southern lowlands within a matter of just a few generations after the population substantially departed. Stone temples that had once stood in open, carefully maintained plazas became completely engulfed by root systems and dense vegetation. Entire cities that had once held tens of thousands of people simply disappeared from any kind of casual view, hidden in plain sight beneath a uniform green canopy that, to anyone flying overhead or hacking through the underbrush below without specialized training, looks indistinguishable from any other patch of unremarkable, undeveloped jungle. That single, simple physical fact, the astonishing speed and thoroughness with which tropical jungle can swallow an entire abandoned city, turns out to be one of the single most important and powerful explanations for why so many people still mistakenly assume the Americas lacked truly substantial ancient cities. It's not that the cities weren't there, or weren't real, or weren't genuinely vast and sophisticated. It's that the specific environment many of them were built within actively works, with remarkable speed and thoroughness, to erase the visible physical evidence the very moment sustained human maintenance of that environment stops. Understanding exactly how thoroughly and how quickly that process of reclamation actually happens, and more importantly, what genuinely cutting-edge modern technology is now finally allowing researchers to see straight through that dense green cover for the very first time, is exactly where we're headed in an upcoming chapter. But first, we need to travel from these jungle ruins forward in time, to a city that European explorers actually encountered while it was still very much alive, thriving, and full of people. A city that several eyewitnesses compared quite favorably to the largest and most impressive cities anywhere in Europe, and then watch in real detail exactly how, and specifically why, that living, breathing city was almost entirely destroyed within the span of just a few catastrophic years. On November 8, 1519, a small group of Spanish soldiers stood on a causeway looking out at a city built in the middle of a lake, and several of them later wrote that they genuinely doubted what they were seeing was real. One soldier in that expedition, a man named Bernal Diaz del Castillo, wrote decades later in his own memoir that some of the men wondered aloud whether they were dreaming, comparing the sight to the enchanted scenes described in a popular chivalric romance novel of the period. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because this wasn't a city the Spanish discovered hidden in a jungle centuries after its abandonment, the way Stevens and Catherwood would later encounter Copan. This was a living, breathing, fully functioning metropolis packed with people going about their daily lives, and the men recording their reactions to it were professional soldiers who had already traveled across Spain, the Caribbean, and Cuba. They had seen cities before. They had simply never seen one quite like this. The city was Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire, built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, in the Valley of Mexico, on the site where Mexico City stands today. And to understand why it left such a powerful impression on its first European visitors, you need to understand both how it was built and roughly how large it actually was at the moment those Spanish soldiers first laid eyes on it. Population estimates for Tenochtitlan at the time of contact vary considerably among historians and archaeologists, and it's worth being upfront about that range rather than picking the most dramatic number and presenting it as settled fact. Estimates generally fall somewhere between roughly 200,000 and 300,000 people for the city itself, with the broader Valley of Mexico, including closely connected satellite cities around the lake, supporting a population that some scholars place at well over 1 million people total. Even using the more conservative end of these estimates, Tenochtitlan was almost certainly larger than any city in Spain at the time, larger than Seville, larger than most of the major cities of Western Europe, and comparable in scale to Paris or Constantinople, two of the largest cities anywhere in the world during that same period. What made the city possible in the first place was an extraordinary feat of engineering, because building a city for several 100,000 people on an island in the middle of a lake is not, on the face of it, an obvious or easy choice. According to Aztec historical tradition, the Mexica people, as the Aztecs called themselves, arrived in the Valley of Mexico sometime in the 1300s as a relatively minor migratory group, and ended up settling on a swampy, unpromising island that more established and powerful groups already controlling the better land around the lake apparently had little interest in claiming for themselves. Rather than treating this as a limitation, the Mexica turned the lake itself into the foundation of an entire urban infrastructure system, and the engineering solutions they developed over the following 2 centuries genuinely rival anything built anywhere else in the world during the same period. The most famous of these innovations were the chinampas, often described in simplified terms as floating gardens, though that description undersells the engineering involved. Chinampas were actually constructed by staking out rectangular plots in the shallow lake bed, building up layers of mud, decayed vegetation, and lake sediment within that staked frame until the plot rose above the waterline, then planting willow trees along the edges whose root systems gradually anchored the whole structure firmly in place, creating an extraordinarily fertile, intensively farmed plot of land that wasn't floating in the literal sense at all, but was permanently fixed in the lake bed while still surrounded by water on all sides. These chinampas could be harvested multiple times per year, and the network surrounding Tenochtitlan and its sister cities is estimated to have covered tens of thousands of acres, providing a substantial portion of the food supply that fed the city's enormous population, a remarkable solution to the basic problem every ancient city had to solve, which is how to reliably feed a large population that mostly isn't farming for itself. Moving people and goods around a city built on a lake required its own distinct set of solutions, and the Aztecs built an extensive network of canals running throughout the city, allowing canoes to transport goods directly to markets and households, supplemented by major raised causeways connecting the island to the mainland, wide enough for substantial numbers of people to cross on foot while still allowing canoe traffic to pass beneath through built-in bridge sections. One of the most sophisticated single pieces of infrastructure in the entire city was a freshwater aqueduct, bringing drinking water in from springs at Chapultepec, on the mainland, because Lake Texcoco itself was partially brackish and not reliably suitable for direct human consumption. Even more impressive from a pure engineering standpoint was an enormous earthen dike, sometimes called the Albaradón de Nezahualcóyotl, after the ruler credited with commissioning it, built across roughly 9 miles of open lake, specifically to separate the saltier eastern portion of the lake from the freshwater western section nearer the city, protecting Tenochtitlan's agricultural and drinking water systems from saltwater contamination during seasonal flooding. This is precisely the kind of large-scale hydraulic engineering that historians studying ancient civilizations elsewhere in the world, particularly in Mesopotamia and ancient China, have long recognized as a hallmark of genuinely sophisticated state organization: the capacity to plan, finance, and execute infrastructure projects spanning years and requiring the coordinated labor of thousands of people working toward a shared engineering goal that no single individual or family could ever accomplish alone. At the heart of the city stood its central market, located in the sister city of Tlatelolco, immediately adjacent to Tenochtitlan and eventually absorbed into the same urban area. Diaz, the same soldier who recorded his comrades' disbelief at first seeing the city, also left behind a detailed account of this marketplace, describing it as larger and better organized than any market he had seen in Spain, with distinct separate sections for different categories of goods: gold and silver, textiles, foodstuffs, pottery, and an enormous range of other merchandise, and with what he estimated as tens of thousands of people moving through it on a typical market day. We should treat that specific numerical estimate with appropriate caution, since it comes from a single eyewitness writing his account decades after the events he was describing, without any kind of independent census data to verify it against. But even setting aside the precise figure, the broader picture his account paints of a highly organized, specialized commercial economy operating at genuinely enormous scale is corroborated by other independent Spanish accounts from the same period and by archaeological evidence of long-distance trade goods recovered from the city, and it stands as a powerful corrective to any lingering assumption that pre-Columbian American societies lacked sophisticated market economies comparable to those found anywhere else in the world at the time. Now we arrive at the part of this story that turns from architectural marvel into genuine tragedy. And it's important to walk through it carefully and honestly, because what happened to Tenochtitlan over the following 2 years represents one of the most consequential and dramatic acts of urban destruction in recorded human history. And understanding exactly how and why it happened tells us something essential about this entire script's larger argument. Hernán Cortés arrived in Tenochtitlan in November of 1519, initially as something closer to a guest than a conqueror, received by the Aztec ruler Moctezuma II under circumstances that remain debated among historians, with some scholars questioning exactly how voluntary or strategic Moctezuma's welcome actually was. Tensions escalated badly over the following months, and by the middle of 1520, open conflict had broken out, with the Spanish and their indigenous allies, notably including the Tlaxcalans, a long-standing rival nation to the Aztecs, who saw the Spanish as a potential tool for finally breaking Aztec dominance over the region, being driven out of the city during a violent retreat that Spanish accounts later called La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, in which a substantial portion of Cortés's own forces were killed attempting to flee across the city's causeways under attack. Cortés regrouped, rebuilt his alliance network, and returned roughly a year later, in 1521, this time laying a sustained siege to the city itself. A siege that lasted around 3 months and proved devastating in ways that extended far beyond direct combat casualties. During this same period, a smallpox epidemic, which we'll examine in much greater depth in the next chapter because of how significant a role disease played across the entire hemisphere, was already tearing through the city's population, having arrived with earlier Spanish contact and spread well ahead of the actual siege itself. Moctezuma had already died during the earlier period of conflict, and his successor, Cuitlahuac, died of smallpox after ruling for only a matter of weeks. The siege itself involved Cortés's forces deliberately cutting off the city's freshwater aqueduct and systematically destroying food supplies, combined with brutal, sustained urban combat that, according to multiple surviving accounts from both Spanish and indigenous sources, included extensive, deliberate destruction of buildings as Spanish forces advanced through the city, district by district, demolishing structures partly as a military tactic to deny defenders any cover, and partly, it seems clear from the historical record, as a calculated strategy to break the city's capacity and will to continue resisting. By the time Tenochtitlan finally fell in August of 1521, the city had been ravaged by months of combined disease, starvation, and systematic physical destruction. Cortés made the deliberate decision to demolish much of what remained of the city's central religious and political core, and construction of the new Spanish colonial capital, which would eventually become Mexico City, began directly on top of the ruins, frequently reusing stone salvaged from the original Aztec temples and palaces as raw building material for Spanish churches and government buildings. The Templo Mayor, the central religious pyramid that had stood at the very heart of Aztec religious and civic life, was systematically dismantled, and a Spanish cathedral was eventually built in the same general location, a pattern of construction directly over and through earlier sacred sites that we'll see repeated at various other sites across the Americas throughout the colonial period. This is worth pausing on directly because it illustrates something important and specific about how the no ancient cities myth actually took hold in this particular case, distinct from the material decay we discussed with Cahokia or the jungle reclamation we just examined with the Maya cities. Tenochtitlan wasn't lost to time, decay, or environmental neglect. It was lost through deliberate, calculated military and political destruction carried out by people who then proceeded to build their own new capital city directly on top of the rubble, in some cases using the literal physical stones of the demolished Aztec structures as raw construction material for the new Spanish buildings rising in their place. For centuries afterward, visitors and residents of colonial and later independent Mexico City walked through streets and plazas built almost directly on top of what had been one of the largest, most sophisticated cities anywhere on Earth, with comparatively little visible physical evidence remaining above ground to suggest what had stood there before, beyond a handful of place names and the layout of certain streets that still loosely trace the footprint of the original Aztec causeways and canals beneath the modern city. Remarkably, and somewhat ironically given everything we've just covered, our most detailed understanding of what Tenochtitlan actually looked like, beyond the archaeological evidence that has gradually been recovered through excavation work conducted underneath modern Mexico City since the 20th century, comes substantially from written accounts left behind by the very Spanish conquerors who participated in its destruction, Diaz's memoir among them, alongside several letters Cortés himself sent back to the Spanish crown, describing the city in considerable, almost admiring detail before describing its subsequent destruction in the very same correspondence. The conquerors, in other words, left behind some of our best written evidence for exactly how impressive the city had been, even as they were simultaneously engaged in tearing it down, which is a genuinely strange and uncomfortable historical irony worth sitting with for a moment, rather than passing over too quickly. The deliberate physical destruction of Tenochtitlan represents one clear, well-documented thread in the larger tapestry of why the empty continent myth managed to take hold and persist for so long afterward. But it's important to be clear that the destruction of the city itself, dramatic and consequential as it undeniably was not actually the single largest factor in the broader depopulation of the Americas following European contact, not by a significant margin. That distinction belongs to something considerably less visible, considerably less directly attributable to any single deliberate human decision, and ultimately responsible for far more death across the hemisphere than every act of direct military conquest combined. That's the subject we need to turn to next, because understanding it properly is absolutely essential to understanding why so much of the Americas appeared comparatively empty to later European arrivals, even in regions where large, thriving, densely populated societies had existed for generations, right up until shortly before those later arrivals actually showed up to see it for themselves. There's a number worth sitting with before we go any further in this chapter, and it comes from a tropical rainforest environment, the kind most relevant to the Maya cities we already discussed, though the underlying physical process applies broadly across many of the warm, humid regions of the Americas where ancient cities once stood. Researchers studying abandoned settlements and agricultural plots in tropical and subtropical climates have found that within as little as 20 to 30 years of sustained human maintenance stopping, secondary forest growth can fully reclaim cleared land, with substantial canopy cover returning within a single generation and full closed canopy forest, indistinguishable to a casual observer from forest that's never been cleared at all, often developing within 50 to 100 years. That's an almost unsettlingly fast timeline. A person could be born after a city's final abandonment, grow up, grow old, and die, all within the span of time it took for the jungle to completely erase the visible evidence that any city had ever stood there at all. We touched on this process in the chapter on the Maya, but it's worth slowing down here and actually walking through the mechanics of how it happens, because understanding the specific physical steps involved helps explain why this particular kind of erasure has been so much more thorough and so much harder to overcome than people generally appreciate. The process typically begins almost immediately after a site is abandoned, with fast-growing pioneer species, plants specifically adapted to rapidly colonize open, sun-exposed ground, taking root within the first growing season in any open plazas, agricultural fields, or cleared spaces that had previously been kept clear through constant, deliberate human labor. These pioneer plants grow quickly, but don't live especially long, and as they mature and eventually die back, they create shaded conditions and enriched soil that allow slower-growing, longer-lived hardwood species to establish themselves underneath. Over a few decades, these hardwoods grow tall enough to form a genuine closed canopy, blocking most direct sunlight from reaching the forest floor below, which in turn changes the entire local ecosystem, shifting it from the open, sun-loving plant community of the immediate post-abandonment period toward the kind of deep shade, high humidity environment typical of mature tropical forest. Here's the part that matters most for our purposes. Tree roots are remarkably effective and remarkably patient at finding and exploiting any weakness in stone construction. A tiny seed lodging in a crack between two perfectly fitted stone blocks atop a Maya temple doesn't need much to get started, just a little moisture and a little organic debris accumulating in that crack. Over years, as that seedling grows into a sapling and then into a mature tree, its root system expands and thickens, and that expansion exerts genuinely enormous mechanical force directly against the stonework surrounding it, gradually prying blocks apart, millimeter by millimeter, year after year. In a process that's slow enough to be invisible on any human timescale shorter than a generation, but powerful enough given centuries to work, to topple entire stone walls and collapse roof structures that had otherwise been built to last for centuries. Visit certain restored sections of Angkor Wat in Cambodia today, a site that experienced a broadly similar pattern of jungle reclamation following its own abandonment, and you can see this process captured in a kind of dramatic freeze frame, enormous strangler fig trees with root systems draped directly over and through ancient stone walls, holding entire sections of wall together with roots in some places, while simultaneously prying other sections apart elsewhere, depending on exactly how that particular tree happened to grow relative to the structure beneath it. Soil accumulation compounds this entire process further. As leaves fall, decompose, and build up year after year, undisturbed by the human activity that would once have kept plazas and walkways regularly swept clean, organic matter gradually accumulates on top of paved surfaces, building up a layer of soil that can reach a meter or more in depth after several centuries of accumulation. This buried soil layer then supports its own thriving plant growth directly on top of structures that may lie completely intact, simply buried beneath this newly formed ground surface, which explains why so many Maya structures discovered by later archaeologists initially looked from the surface like nothing more than an unusually steep, oddly symmetrical hill covered in ordinary jungle vegetation, with the actual stone pyramid or temple structure only becoming apparent once excavators started digging directly into what had appeared, before any digging began, to be completely natural terrain. This is precisely the situation Stevens and Catherwood encountered at Copan in 1839, and it's worth returning briefly to their actual first-hand account, because it captures the lived reality of this process in a way that statistics alone don't quite convey. They described needing to hire local laborers to clear away dense vegetation from what looked, at first approach, like an unremarkable jungle hillside, before the carved stone monuments and architectural features hidden directly beneath that vegetation gradually became visible. Stevens later wrote about the strange experience of standing in a plaza that had clearly been built and deliberately maintained by a sophisticated civilization, yet which had been so thoroughly reclaimed by forest growth that without active clearing work, an observer could walk directly past major architectural monuments without ever realizing they were there at all. It's important, in the interest of accuracy, to note that this jungle reclamation process and the colonial destruction we discussed in the previous chapter with Tenochtitlan were two genuinely different phenomena, operating through entirely different mechanisms, even though both contributed to the same broader pattern of ancient American cities becoming invisible to later observers. Tenochtitlan was destroyed through deliberate, sustained human action, demolished and then deliberately built over by people who knew quite well what they were demolishing and precisely why they were doing it. The Maya cities of the southern lowlands, by sharp contrast, were abandoned by their own original inhabitants centuries before any European ever arrived in the Americas, and were then reclaimed by entirely natural ecological processes that had nothing whatsoever to do with European colonization. Processes that would have happened in exactly the same way regardless of who arrived afterward, or whether anyone arrived to see the results at all. This distinction matters because it shows the no ancient cities myth wasn't really the product of one single cause operating uniformly everywhere across the hemisphere. It was instead the product of several genuinely different processes, each operating through its own distinct mechanism in different specific regions, that all happened to converge on a broadly similar end result: physical evidence of these civilizations becoming dramatically less visible to later observers than the genuine historical scale of what had once existed there would otherwise suggest. There's a related phenomenon worth introducing here as well, one that applies specifically and importantly to many of the earthen mound sites we discussed back in the Mississippian chapter, and it's a process considerably less dramatic and visually striking than jungle reclamation, but in some ways even more thorough and complete in its ultimate effect. Archaeologists call it bioturbation, referring to the gradual disturbance and mixing of soil layers caused by the ordinary biological activity of plant roots, burrowing animals, and earthworms operating continuously and cumulatively over centuries. Even at a site where humans never deliberately destroyed or plowed under an earthwork, the simple ongoing biological activity of a temperate forest or prairie ecosystem will, given enough centuries, gradually soften sharp original edges, slowly mix and blend originally distinct soil layers together, and steadily reduce a once geometrically precise, carefully engineered structure into something that increasingly resembles, to an untrained eye glancing at it, casually from a distance, nothing more than an unremarkable, naturally occurring hill. This is part of why so many smaller mounds across the American Midwest and Southeast went entirely unrecognized by European American settlers for so long. They didn't necessarily look dramatically artificial or obviously constructed by human hands on casual inspection. They looked, especially after centuries of ongoing bioturbation following their builders' original abandonment, very much like ordinary natural terrain features, and it often took a trained, deliberately skeptical archaeological eye willing to seriously question that comfortable, convenient first assumption to recognize the actual, deliberate, carefully engineered human design hidden underneath that deceptively unremarkable, natural-looking surface. Here's a useful way to picture the cumulative difference all of this makes, if it helps to visualize the comparison directly. Imagine two identical letters written on the very same day using the very same ink and the very same paper, with one letter then sealed immediately inside a dry, climate-controlled vault, while the other gets left outside, fully exposed to ordinary weather. Come back in 100 years, and the vaulted letter will likely still be perfectly readable, every individual word still clear and legible exactly as originally written. The letter left outside will likely have disintegrated entirely, leaving behind no trace at all, not because anyone ever did anything to it, and not because its original content was somehow any less significant or meaningful than the content of the other letter, but purely because of the dramatically different environmental conditions each one happened to experience after being written. Ancient cities built in dry, frequently desert-like environments, including much of ancient Egypt, much of ancient Mesopotamia, and meaningfully some sites in the relatively arid American Southwest that we're about to explore in an upcoming chapter, have benefited from something genuinely similar to that climate-controlled vault. Ancient cities built in genuinely humid, biologically active environments, including most of the Maya lowlands and much of the American Southeast, have experienced something much closer to that same letter, left fully exposed outdoors, regardless of how sophisticated, well-organized, or culturally significant the actual society that built each of those respective cities originally happened to be. So where does all of this leave us at this particular point in the broader story we're building across this entire script? We've now examined several genuinely distinct mechanisms working together to explain why ancient American cities became so comparatively invisible over time. Decay of organic, non-stone building materials, examined back in Chapter 4. Deliberate, calculated destruction carried out specifically by colonizing powers, examined directly in the Tenochtitlan chapter. And now, in this chapter, the relentless, steady biological reclamation carried out continuously by living, growing ecosystems themselves, whether through dramatic jungle overgrowth or through slower, quieter bioturbation, working steadily and continuously across temperate landscapes. There's one more major factor we haven't yet examined in proper depth, and in terms of its sheer overall demographic impact across the entire hemisphere. It's almost certainly the single most consequential factor of them all, responsible for more death and ultimately for more genuine loss of accumulated human knowledge, skilled labor, and irreplaceable cultural continuity than every other cause we've discussed in this script so far combined. It moved faster than any conquering army ever could. It frequently arrived at locations well before the people actually carrying it ever did. And in many specific, well-documented cases, it had already devastated and dramatically reshaped entire regions before a single European explorer had ever personally set foot anywhere nearby to witness the genuinely catastrophic demographic aftermath for themselves. That's exactly where we need to turn next. There's a specific moment worth starting with because it captures something genuinely strange and important about how the colonization of the Americas actually unfolded in a way that runs directly against the popular story most people grew up with. In 1539, a Spanish expedition led by Hernando de Soto landed in what's now Florida and spent the next 4 years marching through a huge swath of the American Southeast through present-day Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi, eventually reaching the Mississippi River itself. De Soto's chroniclers, several of whom kept detailed written accounts of the expedition, described passing through a landscape dotted with substantial towns, productive agricultural fields, and a population dense enough that the expedition was frequently able to resupply itself with food taken or traded from local communities along the route. A little over a century later, when French explorers and missionaries began making their own way into roughly the same region, they described something dramatically different. Many of the towns De Soto's chroniclers had documented were gone entirely. Population densities that had clearly supported substantial agricultural settlements a century earlier had collapsed. Some of this later French depopulation reflected the continued decline of the broader Mississippian world we discussed back in Chapter 3, but a meaningful portion of it reflects something else entirely, something that had nothing directly to do with any sustained European military presence in the region at all, because there largely wasn't one yet, not for most of the intervening century. What had happened in region after region across the hemisphere was disease, spreading person to person along existing trade and travel networks, frequently moving well ahead of any sustained direct European presence, and in many specific, well-documented cases, devastating entire regions years or even decades before a European explorer ever personally arrived to witness the demographic aftermath firsthand. This is, without serious competition, the single most important factor in the entire story this script has been building toward, and it deserves to be treated with the full seriousness and care that a genuine human catastrophe of this scale actually demands. Let's start with the basic biological mechanism, because understanding why this happened requires understanding something specific about immunology and the deep history of disease exposure on each side of the Atlantic. Most of the deadliest infectious diseases that became endemic in Europe, Asia, and Africa, including smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and bubonic plague, originated as diseases that jumped from domesticated animals to humans at some point in the deep past, a process that happens far more readily in societies that keep large numbers of densely concentrated livestock in close, sustained proximity to human populations over many successive generations. Cattle, pigs, horses, sheep, and domesticated fowl had all been kept in Europe, Asia, and Africa for thousands of years before European contact with the Americas. And over that long span of time, repeated disease outbreaks gradually exposed those populations to these pathogens again and again across many successive generations, a brutal process that killed enormous numbers of people each time a new pathogen first emerged. But that also gradually left surviving populations with meaningfully higher rates of acquired or inherited immune resistance to those same specific diseases over time. The Americas, by sharp contrast, had comparatively few large domesticated animal species available in the first place. Indigenous peoples across the hemisphere had domesticated llamas and alpacas in the Andes, dogs across much of the continent, and turkeys in parts of Mesoamerica and North America, but none of the larger, more disease-prone livestock species like cattle, pigs, or horses existed anywhere in the Americas prior to European contact, since none of their wild ancestor species happened to be present on the continent to begin with. This meant that the deep, repeated, generations-long exposure to animal origin diseases that had gradually built up meaningful population-level immunity across Europe, Asia, and Africa over thousands of years simply had no equivalent process unfolding anywhere in the Americas. When European, and to a lesser but still significant extent African, diseases first arrived in the hemisphere, they encountered human immune systems with no prior exposure whatsoever, and consequently, with essentially no inherited or acquired resistance to draw upon. The result was almost certainly the deadliest sustained disease event in all of recorded human history, and it's worth being direct and honest about the genuine uncertainty involved in trying to quantify it precisely. Historians and demographers studying this question have produced estimates for the total pre-contact population of the Americas that vary enormously, ranging from as low as around 10 million people up to as high as 100 million or more across the entire hemisphere, depending heavily on which specific scholarly methodology, archaeological evidence base, and set of underlying assumptions about pre-contact agricultural productivity each particular researcher happens to favor. That's a genuinely enormous range, and it reflects real, substantial, ongoing scholarly disagreement rather than simple carelessness or sloppy work on anyone's part, because reconstructing population figures for societies that mostly didn't keep the kind of detailed administrative census records European societies of the same era sometimes did is an extraordinarily difficult historical and archaeological challenge under the best of circumstances. What nearly all serious researchers do agree on, regardless of exactly which specific starting population estimate they personally favor, is that the resulting population decline following sustained contact was catastrophic by any reasonable historical standard, with many estimates suggesting overall population losses somewhere in the range of 75 to 90% or more across the hemisphere as a whole within the century, or so following sustained contact concentrated overwhelmingly in the first wave or two of major epidemic outbreaks in any given specific region. Smallpox was very likely the single deadliest of these diseases, given how it was uniquely well-suited for the specific circumstances of initial contact. The virus has a relatively short incubation period, spreads efficiently through both prolonged close contact and contaminated objects like blankets or clothing, and produces an extremely high mortality rate in any population encountering it for the very first time with no prior immunity whatsoever, frequently killing somewhere between 30 and 50% of those infected in populations with no previous exposure, compared to considerably lower mortality rates typically observed in populations like those in Europe, where the disease had already been endemic for centuries, and a meaningful proportion of survivors had already developed lasting immunity through earlier childhood exposure to milder strains or related diseases. We already touched on one specific devastating example of this directly in the Tenochtitlan chapter, where a major smallpox outbreak swept through the Aztec capital during the very same period as Cortez's siege, killing the Aztec ruler Cuitlahuac after he had reigned for only a matter of weeks, and almost certainly weakening the city's broader capacity to resist the siege far more severely than military combat casualties alone could ever fully account for on their own. But Tenochtitlan represents only one single, relatively well-documented instance of a pattern that repeated itself, region after region, again and again, across the entire hemisphere, frequently with even less direct documentation surviving in cases where, literally, no European observer was present anywhere nearby to witness or record what was happening as it actually unfolded in real time. This is precisely the dynamic that helps explain the De Soto example we opened this chapter with. Historians studying the broader pattern of early contact across what's now the American Southeast have proposed that diseases introduced through earlier, more limited Spanish contact along the Gulf Coast and Atlantic coastline, and potentially even through indirect contact networks originating considerably further away, may have already begun spreading inland well ahead of any sustained European presence, specifically in the interior Southeast itself, devastating Mississippian and related societies in that broader region well before any European explorer had personally traveled far enough inland to witness those specific communities firsthand, while they were still functioning at anything resembling their earlier pre-epidemic scale and vitality. Here's where this connects directly back to one of the central arguments running throughout this entire script. Later, European explorers, settlers, and eventually American colonists frequently encountered landscapes that genuinely did appear comparatively sparsely populated, with visibly depleted or abandoned settlements, overgrown agricultural fields that had once clearly been actively cultivated, and population densities that, to a casual observer with no other context or prior knowledge to draw upon, might reasonably have suggested these lands had simply always been mostly empty, sparsely inhabited wilderness. But that comparatively empty appearance was frequently the direct, tragic aftermath of catastrophic disease mortality that had already swept through and substantially devastated these specific regions, sometimes decades earlier, rather than representing the genuine original pre-contact baseline state of those societies before any of this had ever begun. There is an analogy that might help make this particular distinction land with real clarity. Imagine a detective arriving at the scene of a fire several weeks after it actually occurred, long after the flames themselves have been fully extinguished and the site has been left undisturbed since. The detective sees only blackened, empty rubble, with no remaining sign whatsoever of the furniture, the people, or the daily life that had clearly once filled that exact same space before the fire ever started. If that detective had no other source of information available to draw upon, no photographs taken beforehand, no witness testimony to consult, they might reasonably but mistakenly conclude the site had simply always been an empty, abandoned lot, when in fact it had been a thriving, fully occupied space until quite recently, and the emptiness the detective is now observing firsthand is itself direct, tragic evidence of a recent, severe catastrophe, not evidence at all of some kind of permanent, long-standing absence. Many European observers arriving at various specific American locations decades after the first waves of epidemic disease had already swept through were, in this very real and important sense, exactly like that detective, observing genuine emptiness, but fundamentally misreading what that emptiness actually meant, or in many less charitable cases, perhaps not making any particularly serious or sustained effort to investigate what it might actually mean. This disease-driven depopulation also substantially explains a related and historically significant misconception worth addressing directly. The persistent, deeply mistaken old idea that large stretches of North America functioned as essentially untouched, pristine wilderness prior to European arrival. The same basic misconception we briefly touched on regarding the Amazon back in Chapter 1. Considerable archaeological and historical evidence now indicates that indigenous peoples across North America had actively shaped enormous stretches of the broader landscape for many centuries prior to European contact, including through deliberate, carefully managed controlled burning practices used to maintain open prairie and savanna grassland habitats, intentional management of forest composition to favor certain especially useful tree and plant species, and sophisticated agricultural practices, including the chinampas we already examined directly in the Tenochtitlan chapter, and other related forms of intensive land management found in many other regions across the hemisphere. When disease dramatically reduced indigenous populations across enormous swaths of the continent, this kind of active, ongoing, deliberate landscape management substantially declined as well, allowing forests and grasslands across many regions to gradually shift back toward less intensively managed states within just a few generations, following the most severe waves of epidemic mortality. Later European and American settlers, arriving generations after the most severe epidemic waves had already passed through a given specific region, frequently encountered landscapes that looked, to their own eyes at the time, like untouched natural wilderness, when those exact same landscapes had actually been actively managed, shaped, and maintained by indigenous peoples for many centuries beforehand, right up until disease had substantially disrupted that ongoing active management only shortly before those particular settlers themselves happened to arrive on the scene. It's worth being especially careful and precise here about exactly what conclusion this evidence does and does not support, in keeping with the standard of intellectual honesty we've maintained throughout this entire project. This isn't a claim that European colonizers somehow bear no genuine moral responsibility whatsoever for the devastating consequences that followed European contact and subsequent colonization. Disease frequently traveled directly alongside and was often made dramatically worse by brutal forced labor systems, deliberate calculated violence, forced displacement from traditional homelands, and the systematic destruction of existing social, economic, and political support structures that might otherwise have helped affected communities recover more effectively from epidemic mortality than they often actually managed to. Disease and direct colonial violence were not entirely separate, independent processes operating in full isolation from one another. They were frequently and substantially intertwined, each one actively making the other one considerably worse in its overall effects. The genuinely critical, important point for the specific purposes of this particular chapter is narrower and more focused than a comprehensive moral accounting of the entire colonial encounter. Epidemic disease alone, independent of any other specific factor, was responsible for an absolutely staggering, almost unimaginable scale of death and dramatic societal disruption across the hemisphere, and that disease-driven depopulation substantially and directly shaped how later European arrivals subsequently perceived, described, and ultimately wrote about the lands they were actively encountering and settling. This is exactly why the empty continent framing we identified clearly all the way back in our introduction is so genuinely misleading, in a way that goes well beyond simple, casual historical ignorance or oversight. The continent wasn't empty when sustained European settlement actually began in earnest. It had been emptied rapidly and catastrophically by forces that in the vast majority of specific, well-documented cases moved well ahead of the people who would later look out across the resulting landscape and sincerely, if mistakenly, conclude that no one of any real consequence had ever substantially lived there before them. We've now examined building materials, deliberate colonial destruction, natural ecological reclamation, and devastating epidemic disease, 4 genuinely distinct mechanisms that, taken together, go a very long way toward explaining why the popular imagination still so often pictures the pre-contact Americas as comparatively empty. But there's one more region we haven't yet properly explored in this overall survey, a part of the continent where the underlying environmental challenge facing any ancient builders was almost the complete opposite of the lush, biologically active jungle conditions we examined with the Maya. This is a story of monumental, genuinely sophisticated architecture built instead in one of the driest, most visibly unforgiving environments anywhere on the entire continent. And it raises a genuinely interesting and important question about whether our basic working definition of what actually counts as a city, the same definition we carefully established back in Chapter 1, needs to stretch and adapt somewhat further still to properly account for what was actually built there. In the high desert of what's now northwestern New Mexico, there's a canyon that receives, on average, less than 10 inches of rainfall a year. It's a landscape most modern visitors would describe as harsh, and they wouldn't be wrong. Summer temperatures regularly climb past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, while winter nights can drop well below freezing. There's no permanent river running through it, only a seasonal wash that carries water during occasional storms and sits dry for most of the year. And yet, between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, the people who built in this canyon constructed some of the largest and most precisely engineered structures anywhere in pre-contact North America, in a place where, by almost any conventional measure, building anything at all should have been extraordinarily difficult. This is Chaco Canyon, home to what archaeologists generally refer to as the ancestral Puebloans, sometimes still called by the older term Anasazi in some older literature, though that term, originally adapted from a Navajo word, has fallen out of favor with many contemporary scholars and is generally avoided today out of respect for the preference of the Pueblo peoples who are the direct cultural descendants of the people who built Chaco, and who generally prefer not to use a name imposed from an outside language to describe their own ancestors. Let's start with the architecture itself, because it forces an immediate and useful complication of everything we established about cities back in Chapter 1. The largest structure at Chaco, a complex called Pueblo Bonito, contained somewhere in the range of 600 to 800 individual rooms arranged across multiple stories, in places rising 4 or even 5 stories high, built with a level of masonry precision that genuinely surprises visitors expecting something cruder from a culture working without metal tools or a written numeral system for engineering calculations. The Chacoans built using a sophisticated technique combining a rough sandstone core with a carefully fitted veneer of thin, precisely shaped stone tablets on the visible exterior surfaces, a technique requiring real skilled specialization to execute well, and one that produced walls capable of supporting genuinely enormous structural loads across multiple stories, a real engineering achievement by any reasonable global standard. Here's where the complication comes in, and it's worth being honest about it rather than smoothing it over. Unlike Tenochtitlan or Teotihuacan or Cahokia, the actual full-time resident population living within Pueblo Bonito and the other great houses of Chaco Canyon appears, based on current archaeological evidence, to have been considerably smaller than the sheer physical scale of the architecture alone might initially lead you to assume. Some archaeologists have proposed that the great houses of Chaco may not have functioned primarily as dense, full-time residential housing at all, in the way an apartment compound at Teotihuacan clearly did, but rather as something closer to ceremonial, administrative, and storage centers used intensively and purposefully during certain specific times of the year, particularly around significant solar and lunar calendar events, by a population that swelled dramatically during those specific periods before shrinking back down to a much smaller resident caretaker population for the remainder of the year. This genuinely matters for the question we raised back in Chapter 1, because it pushes directly against a simple, purely population density-based definition of what counts as a city. If Chaco wasn't continuously, densely populated by tens of thousands of permanent year-round residents the way Tenochtitlan clearly was, does it still deserve to be called urban in any meaningful sense. Most archaeologists studying the site today would still say yes, but for somewhat different underlying reasons than population density alone, reasons that ask us to think about the concept of a city slightly differently than we have up to this point. Chaco functioned, by the strong consensus of current archaeological evidence, as the unmistakable central hub of an enormous regional network. Researchers have identified well over 200 outlying Great House communities, scattered across a huge geographic area, stretching across much of what's now the Four Corners region, where Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado all meet, many of them connected back to the Central Canyon by an extensive network of carefully engineered roads. These Chacoan roads are themselves a genuinely remarkable engineering achievement in their own right, built with a striking, deliberate straightness that frequently ignores easier, more practical alternate routes around obstacles in favor of maintaining a rigid, intentional linear path, in some documented cases running directly up and over steep cliff faces using carved stone stairways rather than detouring around them, strongly suggesting these roads carried real ceremonial, cosmological, or symbolic significance that mattered to their builders considerably more than simple, straightforward practical efficiency alone would have required or justified. This is a genuinely important point worth pausing on because it illustrates something we should keep firmly in mind throughout the rest of this script. Not every ancient society organized itself or expressed its own complexity and sophistication around the exact same basic urban template. Tenochtitlan was dense, continuously populated, and built around an enormous functioning daily marketplace economy. Chaco appears to have functioned quite differently, as a relatively sparsely and perhaps only seasonally populated ceremonial and administrative center, sitting at the symbolic and logistical heart of a much larger, more diffuse regional network of smaller communities that all oriented themselves toward it, looked to it for leadership and ceremonial guidance, and very likely gathered there periodically for significant shared ritual events. Both patterns represent genuinely sophisticated forms of large-scale social and political organization. They simply organized that underlying complexity using two meaningfully different spatial and demographic models. The astronomical sophistication on display at Chaco is genuinely remarkable, and in some specific, well-documented respects, rivals or even exceeds what we already discussed regarding the Maya world. The most famous single example is a site called Fajada Butte, where three carefully positioned slabs of rock create a narrow, precisely shaped opening that allows a thin dagger of direct sunlight to fall onto a spiral petroglyph carved into the rock face directly behind them. On the summer solstice specifically, that dagger of light passes directly through the precise center of the spiral. On the winter solstice, two separate daggers of light frame the spiral's outer edges symmetrically. This is exactly the kind of solar alignment evidence we already encountered with Cahokia's wood hinge structure back in Chapter 3, but considerably more visually striking and precise in its specific physical execution, and it provides clear, direct evidence that the Chacoans were tracking the solar year with real precision, almost certainly for a combination of practical agricultural reasons and significant ceremonial or religious purposes that we can only partially reconstruct today. Beyond Fajada Butte, researchers studying the broader layout of Chaco Canyon's major buildings have identified numerous additional architectural alignments connecting major structures to significant solar, lunar, and even particular cardinal directional positions with a level of consistency that strongly argues against pure coincidence. Pueblo Bonito's own outer wall, for instance, runs along an axis closely aligned with true north-south, a level of precision that would have required sustained, careful astronomical observation to achieve using only naked eye methods, with no compass or other precision directional instrument available to the builders. So how exactly did a society manage to support this level of monumental construction and long-distance regional organization in such a genuinely harsh, water-scarce desert environment in the first place? This remains a genuinely active and important area of ongoing archaeological research, and it's worth being honest that several real, significant aspects of the answer remain incompletely understood even today. We know the Chacoans built sophisticated water catchment and diversion systems, channeling the limited seasonal rainfall and occasional flash flood runoff from the surrounding mesa tops down into the canyon for direct agricultural use on specific, carefully positioned floodplain fields. We know that tree ring analysis of the massive wooden roof beams used throughout the great houses, a dating technique called dendrochronology that allows remarkably precise year-by-year dating based on the distinctive pattern of annual growth rings preserved in ancient wood, has shown that an enormous quantity of large timber, tens of thousands of individual logs in total across the whole canyon, was transported into Chaco from forested mountain ranges, located as far as 50 miles away in some specific documented cases, since the canyon and its immediate surroundings simply didn't have local forests capable of supplying timber at anywhere near the necessary scale for this level of sustained, large-scale construction. That timber transport detail deserves a moment of real reflection because of exactly what it implies about the underlying social organization required to make it happen at all. Moving tens of thousands of large logs across 50 miles of difficult desert terrain, with no wheeled carts and no domesticated draft animals available anywhere in the Americas at the time capable of pulling or carrying that kind of sustained heavy load, meant those logs were carried entirely by human labor, walking that considerable distance, almost certainly multiple times over, across many years of sustained construction activity. That's not a project a handful of individual families could organize informally on their own initiative. It requires the same basic kind of centralized planning, sustained large-scale labor coordination, and recognized organizing authority that we've now seen repeatedly in one specific local form or another at every single major site we've examined throughout this entire script, from the basket-carried earth of Cahokia's mounds to the precisely fitted stone of Teotihuacan's pyramids. Chaco's decline, like so many of the other sites we've examined throughout this script, appears to have been driven by a combination of significant environmental and social pressures working together rather than any single isolated cause acting entirely alone. Tree ring evidence indicates a sustained, severe regional drought beginning sometime around 1130 CE, persisting for several decades afterward, placing severe and sustained stress on a society that was already operating right at the very edge of what its specific arid desert environment could reliably sustain, even under more typically favorable climatic conditions. Major new monumental construction activity at Chaco appears to have slowed dramatically and then stopped almost entirely during the same general period, and by sometime in the 1200s, the canyon's significance as the primary, central regional hub had substantially diminished, with population and political influence shifting instead toward other specific regional centers, including sites like Mesa Verde, located considerably further north in what's now southwestern Colorado, where some of Chaco's distinctive cultural and architectural traditions continued to develop and evolve for a while longer, before those specific sites also eventually experienced their own subsequent population declines and abandonments roughly a century or so later. It's important to be genuinely clear that decline and abandonment in this specific historical context did not mean the disappearance or extinction of the people themselves. In precisely the same way, the Maya never actually vanished as a people, despite the dramatic political collapse of their southern lowland cities. The direct cultural and genetic descendants of the people who built Chaco Canyon are the contemporary Pueblo peoples, including the Hopi, Zuni, and the many distinct Pueblo communities located along the Rio Grande Valley in present-day New Mexico, many of whom maintain specific, detailed oral traditions and origin narratives that explicitly and directly connect their own ancestors back to Chaco Canyon and to the broader migrations that followed its decline. This represents an important and genuinely valuable kind of historical continuity that exists entirely independent of and runs alongside the purely archaeological evidence we've been primarily discussing throughout this chapter, and contemporary Pueblo perspectives and oral historical traditions have increasingly and appropriately come to inform how professional archaeologists studying the site today actually interpret what they find there, rather than archaeologists working in total isolation from the perspectives and direct historical knowledge of the very descendant communities most directly connected to this specific ancient history. Why does Chaco matter so directly for the larger argument running throughout this entire script? Partly because it demonstrates, with real and specific clarity, that ancient American societies developed genuinely sophisticated, large-scale forms of social and political organization across an extraordinarily wide and varied range of environments, from the humid, biologically dense tropical jungles of the Maya world to the temperate river floodplains of the Mississippian world, to this harsh, water-scarce, high desert environment that on its surface looks like one of the least likely and least promising places anywhere on the continent to support this level of monumental construction and far-reaching regional organization. And partly because Chaco directly forces a genuinely useful and important broadening of the basic definition of city we originally established back in Chapter 1, reminding us that dense, continuous, year-round residential population isn't actually the only valid pathway toward genuine urban-scale complexity and organization. Sometimes, as Chaco's example clearly demonstrates, that same underlying organizational complexity gets expressed instead through a more dispersed, seasonally concentrated regional network, anchored around one central, highly significant ceremonial and administrative hub, rather than through one single, continuously and densely populated metropolitan center in the more conventional sense. We've now traveled across an enormous range of environments and a correspondingly wide range of architectural and organizational solutions. Coastal desert Peru, the Mississippi River floodplain, the high central plateau of Mexico, the dense tropical lowlands of the Maya world, the lake-bound island capital of the Aztecs, and now the arid high desert of the American Southwest. At this point, it's worth stepping back and asking a more direct, comparative question that pulls several of these specific individual threads together at once. Why exactly is it that stone structures from some of these specific ancient American societies have survived reasonably well into the present day, while comparably significant and sophisticated structures built by other ancient American societies have not survived nearly as well, even in cases where both societies were using broadly similar underlying construction materials? That comparative question is exactly where we're headed next. Let's pose a question directly because it's been sitting quietly underneath several of the last few chapters without getting fully addressed head-on. Tenochtitlan was built substantially out of stone. Chaco Canyon was built substantially out of stone. The Maya cities were built substantially out of stone, and yet all three have, to varying degrees, faded from popular historical memory in ways that places like Rome, Athens, or the great temple complexes of ancient Egypt simply have not. If stone is genuinely as durable as we established back in Chapter 4, why didn't durable building material alone guarantee durable cultural memory? This is actually the right question to ask at this point in the script, because it reveals something important. Physical survival of a structure and survival of cultural and historical memory about that structure are two genuinely separate things, related to each other but not identical. and conflating them is exactly the kind of mistake that allows the no ancient cities myth to persist, even in cases where impressive stone ruins have, in fact, survived perfectly well, and are sitting in plain physical view the entire time. Let's start with the purely physical side of the comparison, because there are real, legitimate differences in durability even among different stone construction traditions, and getting this right matters for accuracy's sake. Roman concrete, used extensively throughout the Roman Empire in structures like the Pantheon's dome, which remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world today, nearly 2,000 years after it was built, benefited from a specific volcanic ash ingredient called pozzolana, which modern materials scientists have found actually continues to chemically strengthen over time when exposed to water through a self-healing process involving the formation of a mineral called calcium aluminum silicate hydrate within microscopic cracks as they form. This is a genuinely unusual and remarkable property, one that ordinary modern concrete typically lacks, and it's part of why so many Roman structures have survived in such comparatively excellent condition across 2,000 years. Most ancient American stone construction, by contrast, including the masonry at Chaco, Teotihuacan, and the Maya cities, relied on dry stacked or mortared stone and adobe-based construction techniques without that same specific, self-reinforcing chemical advantage, meaning those structures were and are somewhat more vulnerable to gradual structural degradation from water infiltration, freeze-thaw cycling in cooler climates, and the kind of root-based mechanical stress we examined directly back in Chapter 8. But this difference in raw material science, while real and worth understanding accurately, is genuinely a comparatively minor factor in the overall story, nowhere near large enough on its own to explain the dramatic difference in popular cultural awareness between, say, the Colosseum and Chaco Canyon's Pueblo Bonito. Plenty of ancient American stone structures have, in fact, survived remarkably well, structurally speaking, right up to the present day. The pyramids at Teotihuacan are still standing, still genuinely massive, still climbable by visitors today. Significant portions of Chichen Itza, Tikal, and Palenque remain standing and structurally intact enough to draw millions of international tourists every single year. The issue, then, clearly isn't primarily that the stone itself failed to physically survive in any kind of broad, sweeping sense. The issue is something else entirely, something considerably more about historical memory, education, and cultural framing than about basic engineering or material science. So let's walk through what actually does explain the difference, because there are several genuinely distinct factors working together here, and it's worth being precise about each one rather than collapsing them into one vague, generalized explanation. The first factor is continuity of written historical tradition, and this one matters enormously. Classical Greek and Roman history survived into the modern European cultural imagination substantially because medieval and Renaissance European scholars had direct, continuous access to a large body of surviving Greek and Latin texts, histories, philosophical works, poetry, and administrative records that had been copied and recopied by hand across many successive generations, preserved substantially through monasteries and later through the Islamic world's own extensive, sophisticated scholarly tradition of preserving and actively building upon classical texts. European intellectual culture, in other words, never actually lost direct, continuous access to its own classical past in any kind of fundamental, comprehensive sense. Educated Europeans in the year 1400 could still read Cicero, Virgil, and Aristotle directly in their own original language, study their work seriously, and build their own emerging intellectual tradition explicitly and directly on top of that surviving classical foundation. Mesoamerican written history, by sharp and devastating contrast, suffered the kind of catastrophic, deliberate destruction we touched on briefly back in Chapter 6, when discussing Maya codices specifically. Spanish missionaries and colonial officials, acting out of a sincere, if from a modern perspective, deeply destructive, religious conviction that indigenous religious texts represented dangerous obstacles to successful Christian conversion, deliberately burned the vast majority of surviving Maya and Aztec written books during the early decades of Spanish colonial rule. A Spanish bishop named Diego de Landa, working in the Yucatan region during the 1560s, is specifically documented as having ordered the destruction of a large number of Maya codices during a single, deliberate, recorded campaign against what colonial church authorities viewed as idolatrous indigenous religious practice and belief. Today, only 4 confirmed authentic pre-Columbian Maya codices are known to survive anywhere in the world, out of what was very likely originally a far larger written corpus comparable in scope, sophistication, and sheer scale to the substantial body of surviving classical Greek and Roman literature that European scholars were fortunate enough to retain full, continuous access to. Think about what that specific, devastating loss actually means in practical terms. Imagine if, hypothetically, 99% of all surviving ancient Greek and Roman texts had been deliberately and systematically destroyed sometime during the European Middle Ages, leaving later European scholars with only a small handful of scattered, isolated fragments to work from in their attempt to reconstruct an entire, once flourishing, literary and historical tradition. European intellectual history as we actually know and understand it today, including the entire Renaissance's explicit, conscious revival of interest in classical learning, would have been functionally impossible to develop in anything resembling its actual historical form, because there simply wouldn't have been enough surviving primary source material left to revive, study, or build directly upon in the first place. That's essentially the situation Mesoamerican history was left in following Spanish colonization, and it's a genuinely huge part of why later European, and eventually American, observers found it so much easier to engage seriously and confidently with classical Mediterranean history than with comparably sophisticated indigenous American history, not because the underlying indigenous history itself was somehow less substantial or significant, but because so much of its own primary, original source material had already been deliberately destroyed before later scholars ever had any real opportunity to study, translate, or build upon it. The second major factor is the specific, very deliberate educational and institutional infrastructure that developed in Europe and was later directly exported to the United States around the specific study of classical antiquity. Beginning substantially in the Renaissance and continuing in increasingly intensive and formalized institutional form through subsequent centuries, European education at the university level, and eventually at the secondary school level as well, came to treat detailed, direct study of Greek and Latin language, literature, and history as an absolutely central, foundational component of what it specifically meant to be considered a properly educated person within elite Western society. This wasn't simply a neutral, value-free reflection of objective historical importance. It represented a specific, deliberate cultural choice about which particular past, out of many genuinely available historical options, a given society had decided to actively organize its core educational institutions and curricula directly around. The United States inherited this same specific educational framework substantially wholesale from Britain and broader Western Europe, and American students for generations have consequently grown up learning specifically and extensively about Roman aqueducts, Greek democracy, and Egyptian pyramids in considerable depth and detail, while typically learning comparatively little, often genuinely next to nothing of real substantive depth, about Cahokia, Chaco Canyon, or Tenochtitlan, despite those specific sites being considerably closer in both straightforward geographic distance and in direct, immediate historical relevance to American students' own actual home country and its land. This is worth sitting with directly, because it's a genuinely different kind of explanation than the purely physical, materials-based explanations we spent considerable earlier chapters carefully working through. It's not really about decay, jungle reclamation, or even primarily about colonial destruction in this specific instance, although that destructive history is certainly closely related and intertwined. It's specifically about which parts of the broader human past a given society has chosen again and again, generation after generation, to actively teach, actively commemorate, and actively fund through sustained, ongoing museum, monument preservation, and dedicated archaeological research funding. Rome gets reconstructed, carefully restored, and well-funded museum exhibits specifically because successive generations of Western institutions have consistently, deliberately decided Rome specifically matters and consistently deserves that kind of sustained funding and attention. Cahokia gets comparatively less of that same kind of sustained institutional attention and dedicated funding, not because the underlying archaeological evidence is somehow inherently less significant or rich, but substantially because the institutions making those specific ongoing funding and curricular decisions have for a very long time operated from a set of inherited cultural priorities and assumptions that didn't happen to place comparable importance and significance on it. There's a useful, clarifying analogy here. Picture two genuinely excellent, equally well-written novels, published in the very same specific year by two different, comparably talented authors. One happens to get selected for inclusion in school curricula across an entire country, gets adapted into successful films, and gets discussed regularly and continuously in respected literary criticism for the following century. The other, despite being every bit as well-crafted, well-written, and substantively significant in its own right, simply doesn't get selected for any of that same sustained, ongoing institutional attention, perhaps for reasons having considerably more to do with the specific publisher's available marketing budget, prevailing critical fashion at that particular moment, or pure historical happenstance, than with any genuine, underlying difference in the book's actual respective literary merit or quality. 100 years later, one novel is still being actively read, taught, and discussed everywhere. The other has been almost entirely and unfairly forgotten by comparison, sitting quietly on a shelf somewhere, despite being every bit as genuinely worthy of sustained attention as its considerably more famous, more widely remembered counterpart. Cultural memory, in other words, doesn't actually track underlying historical or artistic significance in anything resembling a perfectly neutral, purely objective way. It tracks instead a complicated, frequently unfair, historically contingent mixture of who specifically had the institutional power and resources to actively decide and determine what got remembered, preserved, and taught generation after generation, and what consequently simply didn't. The third factor, somewhat related to the second, but still genuinely worth separating out and naming directly and explicitly on its own, is what historians frequently refer to as the broader ideology of colonial terra nullius, a Latin legal term literally meaning land belonging to no one. This specific legal and political doctrine, used at various points across multiple different European colonial projects spanning several different centuries and continents, held that land could be legitimately claimed and settled by a colonizing European power if that specific territory was not already being properly used or developed according to that colonizing power's own particular self-defined cultural standards, standards that frequently and quite conveniently happen to closely match the colonizing power's own specific familiar style of intensive land use back home. Things like permanent fixed-field agriculture, clearly defined and formally documented property boundaries, and visible, recognizable European-style permanent architecture. indigenous land use practices that didn't happen to closely match that specific, self-serving European template, including various forms of carefully managed but seasonally mobile land use, sophisticated controlled burning forest management, or the kind of more dispersed, less visually dramatic regional settlement pattern we examined directly with Chaco Canyon's seasonal ceremonial model back in Chapter 10, were frequently dismissed by colonizing observers at the time as representing unused, underdeveloped, or even outright empty land, regardless of how much sophisticated, deliberate management and organization those specific lands had actually and demonstrably received from the indigenous communities who had originally maintained, shaped, and lived on them for many preceding generations. This doctrine provided a genuinely convenient, self-serving moral and legal justification for colonization, precisely because it conveniently allowed colonizing powers to claim they weren't actually displacing or harming any existing legitimate prior society at all, but were instead simply productively developing supposedly empty, wasted, or underutilized land that had never really belonged meaningfully to anyone in particular beforehand. And this is precisely the underlying ideological soil, to use a deliberately fitting metaphor, in which the broader empty continent myth we've been actively examining and dismantling throughout this entire script originally took root and subsequently managed to spread so effectively and persistently across so many later generations of popular historical understanding. So let's pull all of this directly together now, because we've covered considerable ground across this chapter specifically, and it connects back meaningfully to nearly everything we've already examined throughout the rest of this entire script. Stone genuinely does survive better than wood and packed earth, as a basic matter of straightforward materials science, which is exactly why we devoted real, sustained attention to that particular topic back in Chapter 4. But stone surviving as a purely physical structure is not at all the same specific thing as a society's broader history surviving in active popular cultural memory. That broader kind of memory survival depends considerably more on whether written historical records manage to survive deliberate destruction, whether educational institutions specifically chose to actively teach and meaningfully prioritize that particular history, and whether the prevailing colonial-era ideology of the time found it more convenient and self-serving to remember a given specific place as having been built and actively developed by a real, legitimate prior society, or to instead simply conveniently forget that any meaningfully developed society had ever actually been there at all. This brings us to the genuinely encouraging part of the broader story, the part where some of this long-standing historical erasure is now actively, if gradually, beginning to be corrected and reversed. Because in the past 2 decades specifically, a single, genuinely remarkable piece of modern remote sensing technology has done more to directly challenge and dismantle the entire empty continent myth than perhaps any other single development before it, by allowing researchers to finally and directly see straight through dense tropical jungle canopy that had successfully hidden entire ancient cities from any kind of meaningful, direct human view for many centuries. That's exactly where we're headed next. There's a phrase that shows up constantly in how Americans are taught to talk about 1492, and it's worth examining closely, because the phrase itself carries an entire argument hidden inside it, an argument most people never consciously notice they're accepting. The phrase is the discovery of America. We've touched on this idea once already, briefly back in Chapter 1, but it deserves its own sustained, careful examination now, because by this point in the script, we have enough specific evidence on the table: Caral, Cahokia, Teotihuacan, the Maya cities, Tenochtitlan, Chaco Canyon, to actually test that phrase properly against the historical record, rather than simply accepting it as an unexamined, neutral, common-sense description of what genuinely happened. You cannot discover a place that already has cities in it. You cannot discover a place where someone else is already living, farming, trading, and raising children. What actually happened in 1492 and across the subsequent decades and centuries of sustained European contact and conquest that followed was an encounter between two populations who had previously known absolutely nothing whatsoever about each other's existence. That's a genuinely remarkable, history-altering event in its own right, deserving of serious, sustained historical attention regardless of how it eventually gets specifically framed and described. But encounter and discovery are not neutral, interchangeable synonyms describing the exact same underlying event. They imply two entirely different specific relationships between the people involved. Discovery implies finding something that wasn't meaningfully there before, in any way that genuinely counted. Encounter implies meeting someone who already was. So why did discovery win out so decisively and persist for so long as the dominant framing when encounter would have been every bit as historically accurate, arguably considerably more accurate, given everything we've now covered across this entire script? Answering that question seriously requires looking honestly and directly at how history itself actually gets written, preserved, and subsequently taught. Because history, despite frequently being presented to students as a simple, neutral, settled record of what objectively happened, is in genuine practice always written by particular people, in particular historical and political circumstances, who inevitably and unavoidably make specific choices about what to meaningfully include, what to conveniently leave out, and crucially, which precise words to actually use when describing what they're choosing to include. Let's start with the earliest layer of this specific problem, the first-hand written accounts themselves. Almost everything we currently know in detail about pre-Columbian American societies, from direct written, eyewitness sources, comes substantially from the writings of the conquerors themselves, men like Cortés and Diaz, whose detailed accounts of Tenochtitlan we already drew on extensively back in Chapter 7, or from colonial-era missionaries and administrators who arrived somewhat later and frequently had their own very particular religious and political motivations and reasons for describing indigenous societies and their specific practices in certain deliberately chosen ways rather than others. This doesn't automatically mean every single thing these specific writers recorded was necessarily false. Much of what they wrote down has actually been independently corroborated by separate, completely independent archaeological evidence, exactly the kind of careful, methodical cross-checking process we've consistently relied on and pointed toward throughout this entire script. But it does mean the surviving written record we have access to today is deeply and unavoidably shaped by a fairly narrow, specific range of perspectives, the direct perspectives of men who frequently had very strong, direct personal and institutional incentives to describe the societies they were actively conquering, displacing, and converting in ways that made their own specific actions seem more justified, more necessary, or more straightforwardly inevitable than perhaps a fully neutral, dispassionate historical account might otherwise have actually presented them. Bartolomé de las Casas offers a genuinely useful and important historical counterexample directly worth knowing about here, because he demonstrates that this particular pattern of biased description was never the only possible option available, even at the time these events were actually happening. Las Casas was a Spanish Dominican friar who personally arrived in the Caribbean in the early 1500s, initially participating directly in the colonial system himself, before eventually undergoing a documented, genuine change of conviction and becoming one of the most outspoken, persistent critics of Spanish treatment of indigenous peoples anywhere in the entire Spanish colonial system of his specific era. His detailed written accounts, including a notably forceful work formally titled A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, directly and explicitly documented and condemned colonial violence and ongoing abuse in considerable, often quite graphic, specific detail. And they directly described indigenous societies, in numerous specific instances, as being sophisticated, well-organized, and absolutely worthy of genuine respect rather than casual contempt or dismissal. Las Casas's perspective existed. It was actually written down at the time, and it was even published. But it never came anywhere close to becoming the dominant framing that later generations of European and American historians and educators actually chose to inherit, repeat, and actively pass along to their own students. That specific historiographical choice, embracing the conqueror's generally more self-justifying account over the dissenting critic's considerably more troubled and troubling one, was itself a meaningful, consequential choice, not some kind of simple, neutral, inevitable default. The second major layer of this same broader problem developed considerably later during the specific period when the United States itself was actively engaged in westward continental expansion across the 1800s. This is where the myth of the mound builders, which we already specifically introduced back in Chapter 3, becomes genuinely revealing and important again, because it shows this particular pattern of selective historical bias operating in a noticeably different, more directly self-interested context than the original 16th century Spanish conquest accounts we just discussed. American settlers and farmers in the early to mid-1800s were actively encountering enormous earthen mounds scattered across the Midwest and Southeast, exactly the kind of mounds and earthworks we examined directly back in Chapter 3, at precisely the very same historical moment that the United States government was actively pursuing a sustained, deliberate policy of forcibly removing indigenous peoples from those exact same specific lands. A policy that reached one of its single most devastating and notorious expressions in the forced removal of the Cherokee and other southeastern nations along what later became widely known as the Trail of Tears. It was, to put this as directly and honestly as the historical record itself genuinely supports, considerably more politically and morally convenient for white American settlers actively engaged in displacing living indigenous communities from their own ancestral homelands to simultaneously believe that those exact same specific indigenous communities couldn't possibly have been responsible for building the impressive ancient monuments found scattered across that very land. If the mounds had been built by some entirely separate, safely vanished lost race, perhaps ancient Israelites, or wandering Vikings, or refugees from a sunken Atlantis, certain popular 19th century theories actually proposed all three of these specific possibilities in apparent total seriousness at various points, then the actual living indigenous peoples currently being forcibly displaced from that land could be comfortably and conveniently framed as merely a later, supposedly less accomplished group who had simply moved into a landscape that some other earlier and more sophisticated civilization had originally built and subsequently abandoned long before, rather than being recognized and acknowledged as the actual direct descendants of the very builders themselves. This particular framing conveniently served to further diminish and minimize the achievements and legitimate historical claims of the actual living people the United States government was simultaneously working to displace, dispossess, and forcibly remove from their own ancestral homelands. This specific myth was eventually and quite thoroughly debunked through patient, careful, methodical archaeological work, particularly through a major, systematic Smithsonian Institution survey effort conducted during the 1880s under the direction of an archaeologist named Cyrus Thomas, whose team conducted detailed surveys and careful excavations across literally thousands of individual mound sites and ultimately concluded, based on the accumulated weight of the actual physical evidence, that indigenous peoples and their direct, identifiable ancestors had indeed been entirely and solely responsible for building all of these specific structures. But notice carefully just how long this particular convenient, self-serving myth had already managed to persist by that specific point. And notice as well how much active, ongoing political and social damage it had already managed to do during all those intervening preceding decades, by that point having already provided a comfortable, convenient pseudo-historical justification for displacement policies that, by the specific time Thomas's report was finally and conclusively published in 1894, had already substantially and irreversibly run their full intended course. The third layer of this same broader, recurring problem is the specific layer we already examined in some real detail back in Chapter 11. The deliberate, ongoing institutional choice of which particular historical traditions to actively teach, fund, and consistently prioritize within formal educational curricula, generation after successive generation. But it's worth adding one additional important specific dimension to that earlier discussion here, because it connects directly and meaningfully to the broader theme of this current chapter. Throughout much of the 20th century specifically, American textbooks quite routinely and consistently described pre-Columbian indigenous societies using language that, viewed plainly and honestly today, reads as startlingly and unmistakably reductive and dismissive by comparison with the same textbook's treatment of European history. Indigenous peoples were frequently and repeatedly described in such textbooks using terms like primitive, savage, or nomadic tribes, language that actively and directly obscured or outright erased the genuine, substantial existence of the sophisticated cities, complex empires, and far-reaching trade networks. We've spent this entire script up to this specific point in time carefully documenting and describing in real substantive detail. A student reading a typical mid-20th century American history textbook might come away with a confident, settled general impression that indigenous peoples north of Mexico had lived in small, simple, scattered villages right up until European contact and subsequent settlement, an impression that Cahokia alone, to say nothing of the broader Mississippian world, Chaco Canyon, and the many other major sites we've carefully examined throughout this script, directly and decisively contradicts. This particular pattern has, to be fair and genuinely balanced about it, meaningfully and substantially improved over recent decades. Contemporary archaeology as an active professional discipline has become considerably more careful, self-critical, and methodologically rigorous about actively recognizing and correcting these specific historical and institutional biases. And increasingly, the work itself is being directly informed and meaningfully shaped by collaboration with descendant indigenous communities themselves, exactly the kind of collaborative, multi-perspective approach we already specifically highlighted regarding contemporary Pueblo communities and Chaco Canyon back in Chapter 10. Lidar technology, which we'll be examining directly in full, dedicated detail in the very next chapter, has also played a genuinely significant role here, because satellite and aerial data showing clear, objective evidence of extensive ancient roads, canals, and large-scale settlement patterns is considerably harder for skeptics to simply wave away or dismiss than a single excavated mound or one particular contested written historical account might otherwise be on its own. But the underlying, more fundamental point of this entire chapter still very much stands and deserves to be clearly restated directly. The no ancient cities myth was never actually primarily a simple, neutral, innocent reflection of some kind of genuine, straightforward absence of available archaeological or historical evidence. It was, in very real and substantial part, an active choice made repeatedly across multiple different historical periods by multiple different specific groups of people, each one operating with their own particular specific reasons for finding a story of essential continental emptiness considerably more convenient, more comfortable, and more directly useful to their own immediate interests than the considerably messier, more complicated, but ultimately more historically accurate truth. There's a final important point worth making directly before we move on from this particular chapter, because it's a point this entire script has been quietly working to demonstrate through the accumulated weight of its specific evidence and examples, rather than ever simply stating it outright as an isolated abstract claim. Correcting this kind of specific historical bias doesn't actually require minimizing, exaggerating, or romanticizing anything at all about pre-Columbian American societies in the opposite direction. It doesn't require pretending these societies were uniformly peaceful utopias, free of warfare, social inequality, or their own significant internal problems and failures, when the historical and archaeological evidence we've actually examined throughout this script clearly and directly shows otherwise in numerous specific instances, from Maya intercity warfare to the social stratification suggested by elite burials at Cahokia. It simply requires applying the very same basic, consistent, evidential standards to indigenous American history that have always been quite readily and consistently applied to Greek, Roman, and Egyptian history. Take the actual surviving archaeological and historical evidence genuinely seriously. Acknowledge real, substantial uncertainty honestly wherever it genuinely exists, exactly as we've consistently tried to do at multiple specific points throughout this entire script. And resist the powerful, persistent temptation to simply round a complicated, often genuinely uncomfortable history down to whatever particular simplified version happens to feel most comfortable, most convenient, or most familiar to repeat. That consistent evidential standard is exactly what's now actively driving the single most exciting and rapidly developing area of ongoing archaeological research anywhere in the Americas, a body of brand new evidence that has emerged almost entirely within just the past 2 decades, and that is actively, continuously rewriting population estimates, completely redrawing settlement maps, and decisively overturning still more long-held, outdated historical and archaeological assumptions on a genuinely regular, ongoing basis. It's time to look directly at exactly how that's actually being done and at exactly what it's actively revealing. In 2009, a researcher named Diane Davies was studying a Maya site in Belize called Caral, a city archaeologists had already been excavating, slowly and laboriously by hand, for several decades. Caral's research team decided to try something fairly new at the time for archaeological purposes, commissioning an aerial survey using a technology called lidar, short for light detection and ranging. A small aircraft flew back and forth over the dense jungle canopy covering the site, firing pulses of laser light downward at a rate of many thousands of pulses per second. Most of those pulses bounced back off the leaves and branches of the forest canopy itself, but a meaningful fraction of them found gaps in the foliage and continued on down, striking the actual ground surface beneath before reflecting back up to sensors on the aircraft. By precisely measuring the exact time each individual pulse took to return, and by carefully filtering out all the noise generated by the vegetation-reflected pulses, researchers could computationally reconstruct an extremely detailed, accurate 3-dimensional map of the actual ground surface itself, displayed entirely without the dense jungle canopy that had been sitting directly on top of it and obscuring it from view for centuries. What that survey revealed at Caral stunned the research team. Decades of careful, painstaking, ground-based survey work, walking the site on foot, and physically searching through dense jungle terrain had identified what researchers considered a reasonably comprehensive picture of the site's overall extent and basic layout. The LiDAR survey, completed in a matter of just a few days of actual aerial flight time, revealed an urban area several times larger than anyone had previously realized, including extensive agricultural terracing, additional residential complexes, and a far more elaborate network of roads connecting Caral to other surrounding settlements than ground survey teams had ever been able to fully map on their own, working entirely on foot through genuinely difficult, densely overgrown jungle terrain. This is exactly the kind of single technological breakthrough capable of meaningfully resolving the specific tension we identified directly back in Chapter 8. The tension between knowing, in fairly general principle, that jungle vegetation was actively hiding enormous amounts of archaeological evidence while still lacking any genuinely practical, scalable method for actually finding and properly documenting that hidden evidence across large geographic areas in any kind of reasonably efficient, timely, or comprehensive way. The technology itself spread rapidly through Mesoamerican archaeology over the following decade, and the most dramatic, headline-making single survey came in 2018, when a research initiative called PACUNAM, working across more than 800 square miles of dense jungle terrain in Guatemala's Petén region, released an enormous, comprehensive lidar dataset covering numerous already known Maya sites, along with substantial surrounding areas that had never been seriously, systematically surveyed by archaeologists before at all. The results were genuinely staggering even to researchers who had already been working in the region for years and considered themselves reasonably well-informed about the area's actual likely scale and significance. The survey identified more than 60,000 individual previously undocumented structures, including extensive networks of raised causeways connecting different urban centers, elaborate agricultural terracing systems, and complex irrigation features, and even multiple substantial defensive fortifications, all hidden directly beneath jungle canopy that had given absolutely no visible surface indication whatsoever to ordinary ground-level observation that any of this extensive material was actually there. Based directly on this dramatically expanded settlement evidence, several researchers involved in the project have proposed substantially revised, considerably higher population estimates for the broader classic Maya world than had been generally accepted in the field even just 1 decade earlier, with some specific estimates for total regional population across the broader Maya lowlands during their documented classic period peak, now reaching into the range of 10 to 15 million people or more, figures that would have struck many specialists working in the field as quite implausibly, almost absurdly high if they had been seriously proposed by anyone as recently as the early 2000s. It's important, in keeping with the standard of intellectual honesty we've consistently tried to maintain throughout this entire script, to note directly that these specific revised, considerably higher population figures remain a genuinely active and ongoing subject of real scholarly debate and discussion, with some researchers in the field expressing legitimate methodological caution about extrapolating total regional population estimates quite this confidently from settlement density data alone, however impressively comprehensive that underlying lidar data itself may now actually be. But even researchers who remain personally somewhat more cautious about the very highest specific proposed numbers broadly and explicitly agree that the lidar evidence as a whole has clearly and decisively demonstrated that previous population and settlement extent estimates for the classic Maya world were very likely too conservative, in some specific instances, perhaps by a very substantial margin indeed. The technology hasn't been limited only to the Maya region, and its broader application across the Americas tells a genuinely consistent, recurring story worth examining directly. In the Amazon basin, which we already briefly introduced all the way back in Chapter 1 specifically as an example of the outdated, now substantially discredited, pristine wilderness assumption, lidar surveys conducted over the past several years have identified extensive networks of geometric earthworks, carefully engineered raised agricultural fields, and substantial settlement mounds across multiple different specific regions of the basin, providing strong, clear, converging physical evidence supporting research that archaeologists studying soil composition and plant domestication patterns in the Amazon had already been actively and persuasively arguing for on other independent evidentiary grounds for some time before the lidar data itself became available to directly confirm it. A particularly striking specific example comes from the Llanos de Mojos region of Bolivia, where lidar surveys published in 2022 revealed an extensive, previously unknown network of substantial urban centers connected to one another by formal causeways and surrounded by extensive water management infrastructure, dating to a period roughly between 500 and 1400 CE, providing clear, direct physical evidence of a genuinely sophisticated, large-scale, low-density urban civilization that had developed within the Amazon basin, directly contradicting the older, by now thoroughly outdated assumption we already specifically discussed back in Chapter 1, that the region's notably poor underlying soil quality made any kind of substantial, sustained urban-scale settlement there fundamentally impossible. In the southeastern United States specifically, lidar surveys have similarly been actively used to identify previously unknown and unmapped earthworks directly connected to the broader Mississippian world we already examined in real sustained detail back in Chapter 3, including substantial mound complexes hidden beneath dense modern forest cover that had developed naturally and gradually on the actual sites themselves. In the many intervening centuries since their original abandonment, sites that conventional ground-based survey work had simply never identified or properly documented at all, precisely because, exactly as we discussed directly back in Chapter 8 regarding bioturbation, centuries of accumulated soil development and ordinary forest growth had gradually and effectively disguised their original, clearly artificial and deliberately engineered shape so thoroughly and effectively that they no longer looked obviously man-made to any casual, untrained observer walking directly across them on the ground. So why exactly does this specific technology work so remarkably well for this particular kind of comprehensive archaeological discovery when more traditional methods so often previously struggled and failed? The core underlying advantage comes down substantially to simple scale and underlying efficiency. A team of archaeologists physically walking a survey transect on foot through dense jungle terrain might reasonably cover, on a genuinely good working day, somewhere in the range of 1 or 2 square miles of actual ground, and that's before even accounting for the very real, practical difficulty of actually recognizing a heavily overgrown, centuries-old earthen structure as something genuinely artificial and deliberately built, rather than simply registering it, understandably, as just another unremarkable natural hill or ridge while walking directly past it. A lidar-equipped aircraft, by sharp contrast, can comprehensively survey hundreds of square miles in just a single day of active flight time. And because the underlying data is captured in such precise, fully digital, three-dimensional form, researchers can subsequently apply sophisticated computational filtering techniques afterward, specifically designed to help systematically identify subtle, artificial geometric patterns, things like unnaturally straight lines, perfectly consistent right angles, or precisely repeated geometric structural shapes that the human eye alone would likely never reliably catch when looking only at raw, unprocessed satellite or aerial photography, but which become considerably more visually apparent and obvious once the dense, obscuring vegetation has been computationally stripped away through the lidar data processing pipeline. There's a genuinely useful illustrative analogy here that helps make clear exactly why this technological breakthrough has proven so significant. Imagine trying to determine the precise layout, dimensions, and significant architectural features of an entire furnished house while looking at it only from directly outside through a single small, heavily frosted window with virtually all of the actual interior detail effectively obscured and hidden from any kind of clear, direct view. That's roughly comparable to what ground-based jungle archaeology was generally and necessarily limited to for many generations. Genuinely valuable, careful work, but inherently constrained by what a small team of researchers could physically access, properly recognize, and adequately document using only their own direct eyes and feet across a comparatively limited, restricted area. LiDAR is roughly equivalent to suddenly being handed a complete, fully detailed architectural blueprint of that exact same house instead, showing you precisely where every single wall, doorway, and room actually is, all without ever needing to personally and physically enter the building itself at all. The underlying house, in this analogy, was always genuinely and fully there from the very beginning. The fundamental problem was never really that the relevant archaeological evidence itself didn't actually exist. The problem was simply and specifically that nobody had yet had access to the right specific tool capable of actually seeing clearly through whatever particular obstacle happened to be blocking that evidence from view. This technological breakthrough connects directly and meaningfully back to one of the single most important running themes of this entire script. We opened all the way back in Chapter 1 with the specific story of the Amazon's so-called pristine wilderness myth being substantially overturned by exactly this same kind of remote sensing technology. We've spent the many intervening chapters since then carefully walking through site after site, civilization after civilization, where genuinely substantial, sophisticated ancient cities had become comparatively invisible to later observers for one specific reason or another: building material decay, deliberate colonial destruction, natural jungle reclamation, devastating epidemic disease, or simply persistent long-standing institutional and educational bias. LiDAR technology represents something genuinely new and significant within that broader overall pattern: a powerful, scalable, increasingly accessible technological tool specifically and directly capable of overcoming several of these distinct historical obstacles all at once by allowing researchers to directly and systematically see straight through dense vegetation, to comprehensively survey truly enormous geographic areas in a remarkably short amount of practical working time, and to do all of this without requiring the same kind of extensive, often quite difficult and resource-intensive ground-level physical access that more traditional archaeological survey methods have always specifically required. It's important, in the interest of accuracy and intellectual honesty, to be clear about what LiDAR can and cannot actually do on its own, because the technology, however genuinely impressive and powerful it undoubtedly is most certainly not any kind of magic, all-purpose solution capable of effortlessly and instantly answering every single remaining open archaeological question we've encountered throughout this entire script. LiDAR is extremely good at reliably revealing the overall presence, precise location, and basic geometric shape of buried or heavily overgrown structures. It cannot, on its own, tell researchers who specifically built a given structure, what particular specific purpose that structure actually served, or what year it was actually built in, with any real precision. Answering those kinds of more specific, detailed questions still requires the same kind of painstaking, careful, traditional, ground-based archaeological excavation work we've described and referenced throughout this entire script, digging carefully and systematically through the relevant soil layers, recovering and properly analyzing artifacts, and conducting precise radiocarbon dating and other complementary scientific testing methods, the same fundamental kind of patient, detailed work that originally first identified and properly dated Caral all the way back in Chapter 2, well before LiDAR technology itself had even been developed or seriously considered as a viable archaeological tool. What LiDAR specifically and effectively does is tell research teams precisely where to actually focus that more detailed, resource-intensive, and inherently time-consuming traditional excavation effort dramatically and efficiently narrowing down which specific locations out of an often otherwise overwhelmingly vast search area are most likely to genuinely reward the very real-time, effort, and often quite substantial associated cost that careful, properly conducted archaeological excavation always specifically requires. Here's where this entire chapter, and in many genuine respects this entire script as a whole, actually arrives at its most directly hopeful and forward-looking point. The "no ancient cities" myth was never, at any point throughout this entire examination, actually true. What has genuinely changed, and what specifically continues to change at a remarkably rapid pace even today, is simply our own collective, evolving capacity to actually see the substantial physical evidence that has, in point of fact, been sitting there in the ground the entire time, waiting patiently to be properly found, recognized, and finally taken fully seriously by anyone willing to look at it directly and carefully enough. Every single site we've examined together throughout this entire script, Caral, Cahokia, Teotihuacan, the Maya cities, Tenochtitlan, Chaco Canyon, was always genuinely there, always real, and always exactly as significant and substantial as we've described it throughout this entire careful examination. What's specifically and rapidly changing right now, in real time, is simply our own collective ability and willingness to finally look at all of it clearly, honestly, and with the full degree of serious, scholarly attention it has always genuinely deserved from the very beginning. That brings us finally to the natural and appropriate point of stepping back from all these individual, specific sites and stories we've carefully examined one by one, and asking what the complete picture actually adds up to when we finally consider it as a single, unified whole. We started this journey with a simple, widely held assumption that ancient cities belonged to the Old World, while the Americas remained largely empty until Europeans arrived to build something on them. By now, that assumption should feel less like settled fact and more like a question worth asking directly. Where did it actually come from, and what was it actually built to justify? Let's walk back through what we've actually found, because the cumulative picture is genuinely worth holding in your mind all at once, rather than scattered across 13 separate chapters. Caral was raising monumental platform mounds on the Peruvian coast around the same time Egyptians were finishing the Great Pyramid of Giza, built on an economic foundation of cotton and fish, rather than grain, with no writing and apparently no warfare, organizing thousands of people around shared ceremonial plazas and the steady rhythm of bone flutes. Cahokia rose along the Mississippi 1,000 years later, a city of earth and timber that may have rivaled London in population, its builders tracking the solstices with the same kind of careful, astronomical precision that Stonehenge represents in Britain, using nothing but woven baskets to move 22 million cubic feet of soil one load at a time. Teotihuacan grew into a genuine cosmopolitan metropolis of apartment compounds and foreign neighborhoods, a city so old by the time the Aztecs found it that they had no idea who built it and assumed it must have been the gods. The Maya developed independent mathematics, a written language, and astronomical observations precise enough to track Venus within 2 hours of accuracy across 5 centuries, sustaining dozens of city-states for well over a millennium before drought, deforestation, and escalating warfare combined to bring the southern lowlands down. Tenochtitlan rose out of a lake through engineering so sophisticated that Spanish soldiers who'd seen the great cities of Europe still doubted their own eyes, and then was deliberately leveled and built over within 2 years of first contact. Chaco Canyon proved that monumental, astronomically aligned construction could rise even in one of the most water-scarce environments on the continent, organized not around dense permanent population, but around a seasonal ceremonial network spanning the entire Four Corners region, None of these were minor settlements. None of them were villages that later observers simply mislabeled out of ignorance. They were cities, by any fair and consistent definition of that word, built by people who solved the same fundamental problems every complex society has always had to solve: how to feed people who aren't farming, how to organize labor across generations, how to track time, how to govern, how to trade across long distances, how to build something that outlasts any single lifetime. They solved those problems independently, without contact with the old world, often centuries ahead of when conventional textbooks once assumed civilization had even reached the hemisphere at all. So why did the myth take hold anyway? We found the answer wasn't a single cause, but a genuine convergence of several distinct ones, each operating through its own mechanism, each reinforcing the others. Wood and packed earth decay in ways that cut stone simply doesn't. So Cahokia's mounds eroded into grassy hills while Roman concrete still holds its dome. Tropical jungle reclaims abandoned settlements within a single human lifetime, root systems prying apart stonework that took generations to build, soil accumulating until a hidden pyramid looks indistinguishable from an ordinary hillside. Disease, arriving along trade routes well ahead of any sustained European presence, killed somewhere between 3/4 and 9/10 of the hemisphere's population within roughly a century, hollowing out landscapes that later arrivals then mistook for having always been empty. Cortés didn't stumble onto an abandoned ruin. He deliberately destroyed a living city of several 100,000 people and built a new capital directly on top of the rubble. And running underneath all of it, a set of historiographical choices, which accounts got written down, which got burned, which got taught in which schools, which got assigned the comfortable label of discovery rather than the more honest label of encounter, consistently favored the version of history that made colonization easier to justify and easier to live with. It's worth being honest about something else here, too, in keeping with the standard we tried to hold throughout this whole project. None of this is an argument that pre-Columbian societies were uniformly peaceful, perfectly organized, or somehow beyond the ordinary failures and conflicts that mark every human civilization. The Maya fought brutal wars between rival cities. Cahokia's elite burials suggest real social stratification and possibly practices we'd now consider deeply troubling. Teotihuacan's own collapse appears to have come from internal violence directed at its ruling class. These were real societies, made of real people, with real successes and real failures, exactly like Rome, exactly like Egypt, exactly like every other complex civilization history has ever produced. Treating them with serious historical attention doesn't mean romanticizing them. It just means applying the same evidentiary standard we'd apply to anyone else. What's genuinely remarkable, and what feels like the right note to end on, is how recent so much of this corrective evidence actually is. Caral's true age was only firmly established in 2001. The most dramatic lidar surveys of the Maya lowlands came out in 2018. The Amazon's hidden cities are still being mapped as you listen to this right now, in ongoing research that will very likely revise some of the specific numbers in this script within just a few more years. We are living through one of the more active periods of historical revision in a long time, not because historians suddenly decided to rewrite the past for ideological reasons, but because the tools for actually seeing the past have improved faster than almost anyone studying this material 20 years ago would have predicted. That's worth sitting with for a moment because it cuts against a quietly comforting but ultimately false idea many of us absorb without noticing. The idea that history is basically settled, a fixed body of facts simply waiting to be memorized, rather than a living field of inquiry that keeps producing genuinely new findings. The map of ancient America is being redrawn in real time, city by city, survey by survey, and the broad direction of that redrawing has been remarkably consistent. Almost every new piece of evidence has pointed the same way. More people, more cities, more sophistication, longer timelines than the previous generation of scholarship assumed. That's not a coincidence. It's the predictable result of finally pointing better tools and fewer inherited biases at a continent that was underestimated for a very long time. So what should you actually do with all of this now that you've spent several hours walking through it? Probably not memorize the population estimates, several of which will likely be revised again within the decade. The more durable thing to take away is the habit of mind underneath all of it. When you encounter a confident claim about the deep past, especially one that conveniently happens to flatter the people making it, it's worth asking the same question this whole project has been asking, chapter after chapter. Is this actually what the evidence shows? Or is this simply the version of the past that's been easiest, most comfortable, or most useful for someone to tell? Next time you hear the phrase, the New World, it might be worth pausing on it for just a second. New to whom exactly? Caral was already 2,000 years old by the time the phrase was first uttered. Cahokia had already risen and fallen. Teotihuacan was already an ancient ruin that the Aztecs themselves walked through as tourists, wondering who could possibly have built it. The world wasn't new. It had simply been waiting for a very long time for the rest of us to finally catch up to what was always there.